Chapter 417. Thanks to the protection of the origin armor, Daramar's abdomen had been injured, but the injury wasn't too serious. What had truly caused him a lot of damage was one of his secondary heads being cut off. Even the fingers were connected to the heart, let alone a single head. Every head of the 9-headed demon dragon gave him an additional appraisal bonus when resisting the negative effects such as blindness, deafness, charm, intimidation, dizziness, and panic. On the contrary, Daramar would be weakened with every head he lost. If he lost all his heads, he would immediately die. Without his wings, the Hydra could no longer rely on flight to avoid attacks from below like the Megalosaurus. However, his physique was far stronger than the average Megalosaurus, even by the standards of the ancient red dragons. Like a train that had deviated from its tracks, Daramar immediately scrambled to retreat far away after losing his head. As cunning as he was, he made use of the nearby giant bull demons, who were heavily injured and had difficulty moving, to use their massive bodies as cover. This is a bloody battlefield. The Bador Legion should cooperate sincerely. After all, we're facing the demon Tanaree. Daramar tried his best to justify himself, as if wanting to use this as an opportunity to change the target of the Pit Fiend Summoner's attack. However, whether it was himself or the attacking Megalosaurus, they were no longer naive. They wouldn't be moved by simple words. Besides, Keyes wasn't really like what Daramar thought. He was a pit fiend from the Bador Legion that had come to supervise the battle. He'd brought Avengers with him, and there was more than one. The Spectre dragons were residing in the body of the clockwork Megalosaurus, and had long since been unable to endure their thirst. You're a traitor who speaks irresponsibly. With a series of creaking sounds, the clockwork Megalosaurus roared in Draconic. It had fused with a music box with mech fusion, giving it the ability to speak. You will burn to ashes in the fury of the Megalosaurus. You will drown in the burning acid. You will beg for a quick death in the putrid swamp. You will fall apart in the merciless lightning prison. You will definitely perish in the cold wind. The spirit dragons cast their curses on Dharma, who was greatly shaken. Every single one of them did the same. Although these curses did not contain any magic elements, anyone could hear the endless resentment and determination in them. If he could not guess the origin of the enemy in front of him, Dharma would not have evolved from a green dragon into a 9-headed demonic dragon, but a multi-headed snake lizard. His intelligence wasn't that bad. The remaining 8 heads revealed shocked expressions at the same time. The 16 eyes were widened by Dharma at the same time. You are the remnants of the Megalosaurus army. The 9-headed demon dragon couldn't help but take a step back. Once again, he became cautious of the enemy before him, and began to analyze the enemy's true background. The clockwork Megalosaurus tail, which was made of chains, was pulled out from the ground. Its serrated pincers were holding onto the ferocious dragon head. This secondary head of the 9-headed demon dragon had yet to lose its vitality. Its bloody mouth was still slightly open, as if it was struggling to escape. It's still quite lively. It's a pity to waste it. Thinking of something, Keyes, who was hovering in the air, immediately used his psionic ability to communicate with the clockwork Megalosaurus that was crushing this head. The latter then swung its tail and threw the spoils of war high up into the air, throwing it at the young blue dragon as if it was a baseball. Oh, I'll leave that traitor to you guys, but remember to try out the new abilities of this new body. After getting Keyes' approval, the clockwork Megalosaurus body was completely opened up to the spirit dragons, allowing them to do whatever they wanted. Following the spirit dragons' thoughts, as well as their unreserved soul power, the clockwork Megalosaurus body suddenly became noisy. A layer of cold frost began to appear on the armor plate made of Bartholomew, tightly sealing the energy in the body. The huge clockwork on its back, driven by the multi-stroke engine of Moradin, spun rapidly as if it was crazy. With the help of the spring taken from the mechanical realm legend, the surging heat energy was converted into potential energy, waiting for a certain moment to erupt. In the creaking sound of gears engaging, The wings of the clockwork megalosaurus instantly transformed into two spinning chainsaws. After the preparation was completed, the armor plates on the two ribs of the clockwork megalosaurus suddenly opened, and hot steam came out with a sizzling sound. Activate Assault Mode. Just as Keyes looked on with great interest, his legendary creation moved from stillness and launched a fierce attack on the target of revenge. The huge clockwork once again spun wildly, but in the opposite direction from before. The potential energy that had accumulated to the limit was instantly released, transforming into surging power, driving this behemoth forward rapidly. In assault mode, the clockwork megalosaurus seemed to no longer be weakened by the agility brought about by its size and weight. It was so agile that it made one's hair stand on end. At this moment, this legendary construct creature was like the kind of Kwai Ka-Ling that was known for its agility, running faster than the speed of sound. Bang, bang, bang. In a series of sonic booms, the ground of the acid fog canyon was plowed into deep ravines. Moreover, the clockwork megalosaurus did not turn at all, either because it did not want to waste time in assault mode, or because it did not want to deal with the target. Without any detour, this huge construct creature directly pounced on the nine-headed demon dragon that was waiting for it. The first thing that came into contact with the enemy was not the fangs and claws of the clockwork megalosaurus, but the spinning chainsaws that were transformed from its wings. Like a grappling hug, the two spinning chainsaws worked on the left and right, cutting toward Dalamar's neck from both sides with a buzzing sound. Even though he reacted in time, allowing the chainsaws to cut through the origin armor, the feeling of being shocked still did not feel good. Amidst the nauseating noises, the chainsaws and the origin armor began to compete, instantly bursting out endless sparks. You're courting death. The nine-headed demon dragon began to counterattack, its remaining 8 heads biting toward the clockwork megalosaurus from different directions. However, this legendary construct creature was the first to crash into its chest, interrupting its words and even breaking a few of its sternum. Corrosion Spell. The nine-headed demon dragon, who was being attacked head-on by the clockwork megalosaurus, immediately began to use magic abilities to deal with the enemy in front of it. Because it had many heads, Dalamar's casting speed was much faster than when it was in its green dragon form, and the strength of its magic effects was also increased. Within a few breaths, a faint red mist shrouded the huge body of the clockwork megalosaurus, and the corrosion spell instantly took effect. On the body of the clockwork megalosaurus, many parts that were not made of bartoluite and other corrosion-resistant materials, especially some of the gears, began to rust, their strength greatly decreased, and then they cracked and fell off. It was only at this moment that a sly smile appeared on the face of Dalamar's head. It's time. After a few mutters, the muscles of the nine-headed demon dragon's severed heads suddenly swelled, and 2 new heads grew out. Chapter 4:18. Although the Hydra's counterattack was not flashy, it was simple and practical, especially for a construct creature. In the light red mist of the rust spell, the construct creature would disintegrate bit by bit every moment, and the damage would accumulate. Compared to before, Daramar was much more confident. He even had the mind to mock his opponent during the attack. Are you lacking calcium? Your creator probably didn't give you a good set of teeth. Your scratches are weak. These taunts caused Daramar to suffer an even stronger blow than he had imagined. Due to some broken gears, the megalosaurus drill-like shark claws could not rotate completely for the time being. However, the remaining rotating claws still worked tenaciously and easily peeled off Daramar's scales and thick skin. They knew the characteristics of the opponent. When one head was cut off, 2 would grow out, and each head would make it stronger. Even the spirit dragons that controlled the megalosaurus's movements did not believe that there was no limit to this ability to cut off the head's strength. However, they would not cut blindly, at least not before they could cut off all the heads at once. The megalosaurus changed its strategy. In a strong attack mode, this legendary construct creature was amazingly agile. The chainsaw that popped out from its back danced like a butterfly among flowers. Together with the rotating claws, the Megalosaurus created wounds on Daramar's body, making it difficult for the opponent to deal with. However, after evolving into the Hydra, Daramar's physique had been greatly improved. These wounds were actually not serious to him. As time passed, more and more pus flowed out from the wounds, and the broken flesh and scales were quickly glued together. At the same time, with 10 heads on his shoulders, his spellcasting ability had also improved greatly. Although it was still not like Tiamat, where each head could cast different spells, the strength and chanting speed of Daramar's spells had become completely different from before. He could even provide some super magic effects to the spells he cast, like some legendary spellcasters. Spell Maximum, Gigantification. As the incantation reached the target, the dragon head warhammer that had been in the vice leader's mouth suddenly changed and rapidly expanded. Twisting his neck forcefully, Daramar held the hammer in his mouth and swung the dragon-headed warhammer, accurately hitting the Megalosaurus' sharp claws. However, this was not the end of the attack. The real killer move was actually hidden in the head of the dragon head warhammer. Clang, clang, clang. The ferocious dragon head on the giant warhammer instantly came to life and bit down viciously on one of the clockwork dragon's claws. Then, it quickly swallowed the dragon's claws into its mouth. The sound of metal being twisted suddenly rang out. Megalosaurus's entire arm hung limply on the ground due to the weight of the hammer. Taking advantage of this gap, Daramar grabbed his opponent's other intact arm and quickly moved to the side. Transfiguration. The 9-headed Hydra's secondary heads and necks turned into thick tentacles that coiled around the Megalosaurus's spinning springs, forcefully stopping it from spinning. Creak, creak. Although Daramar's tentacles had turned into a bloody mess, the Megalosaurus was obviously more affected. Under the effects of the rust spell, the strength of the gears and springs within its body decreased. Under the force breaking, they all broke and collapsed. The Megalosaurus was forced out of its assault mode. Caught you. After temporarily suppressing this terrifying construct, Daramar's main head stared at Keys, who was still watching the show. Little devil, I'll deal with you later. Daramar thought to himself. He'd already listed out a series of methods to deal with pit fiends. Once he disassembled this construct, he would put them into practice. When he thought of this, he no longer hesitated. He immediately leaned over the Megalosaurus, using his abdomen that was covered in origin armor to suppress the clawed arm that he'd just captured. Daramar then stretched out his 2 forelimbs, grabbing the construct's head and twisting it forcefully. Let's see what other tricks you have up your sleeve. After the head of the clockwork dragon rotated nearly 180 degrees, many of the internal parts of the clockwork dragon exploded. The construct that had been attacking the Hydra ferociously just a moment ago suddenly collapsed to the ground, seemingly on the verge of death. Seeing this, Keys couldn't help but shrug his shoulders. It's still not enough to rely on actual combat. It's a pity. I've watched more movies than you. Keys calmly exchanged glances with Daramar, waving his hand kindly. Uffed! Before Daramar could react, the head of the clockwork dragon, which seemed to have been broken, suddenly opened its bloody mouth. Steel drill breath. Just like the alien that Keys had seen in the movies from his previous world, a steel drill with a structure similar to the inner teeth of the alien suddenly shot out from the Megalosaurus' mouth, piercing through Daramar's chest. It's us who caught you, little traitor. This sudden upheaval made the Hydra terrified. He didn't care about tearing his own wounds and wanted to escape first. Unfortunately, not only did he not watch as many movies as Keys, but he also played very few games. Blast take off. Daramar, who hadn't understood the meaning of this sentence, didn't have time to think. A violent explosion suddenly occurred below him. The Megalosaurus used its most powerful legendary ability, which it could only use once a week. Following the will of this legendary construct, half of its body turned into an equivalent amount of high explosives and immediately detonated. The shockwave, shrapnel, and heat would cause unimaginable damage to the enemy directly facing this explosion. The remaining body of the Megalosaurus was protected by the eternal ice, so it wouldn't be affected by the explosion. Although Daramar wasn't afraid of the high temperature of the flames, because he was too close, the flying shrapnel and shockwave still sent him flying. When he landed on the ground, he was covered in wounds. The Hydra's originally healthy, gem-like green skin had now become much lighter, like a cup of chartreuse that had changed its quality. What was even more terrifying was that there was a huge hole in his chest, and his internal organs were blown into paste, dripping out of his body. The explosion affected a wide area. The gigantic bull demons that had fainted earlier, as well as the blood-armored demons and Buffet who were fighting, were all baptized by the shockwave. Even the walls of Fort Bator in the distance had a small part of it collapsed. The spirit dragons residing in the Megalosaurus body seemed to be shocked by the terrifying explosion, and their souls were constantly in turmoil. Keys, who had escaped early, flashed back and used his psionic ability to communicate with the spirit dragons. Don't worry, this happens often. The spirit dragons. The following content will not be counted in the word count. Thank you to Stargazing 1996, Shouting 246, Bookfriend 201905291712262230, Ink Trip, and other big shots for tips. Your support is the motivation for the new author to work hard to update. Chapter 419. Suffering from the clockwork Megalosaurus's unique legendary spell, Explosion to the Heavens, Daramar had lost more than 90% of his life. Given enough time, with his powerful self-healing ability, he would only need half a day to recover some of his vitality. But Keys, who was very immersed in the game, actually got itchy and brazenly snatched the nine-headed demon dragon's head. Of course, his actions were more subtle. Not only did he not use any physical attacks, he did not even use any damaging spells. Spell penetration, malicious transfiguration. Following the young blue dragon's incantation, the struggling Daramar instantly turned into an ordinary dragon beast with a poof. His internal organs were heavily injured, more than 90% of his bones were shattered, and he did not have the strong physique of the nine-headed demon dragon. What else could he do? There was only death. A mere malicious transfiguration took the life of the nine-headed demon dragon, as well as the legend of the evil dragon that had yet to be spread. Thus, almost like a trick, Keys easily obtained the 2 general flags that floated out of Daramar's body after his death. He actually has 3 general flags. Looking at the gains in his hands, Keys could not help but be secretly shocked. Although he had already guessed that since Daramar was able to obtain the authority to command the demon fortress, he had most likely obtained a general flag. But what Keys did not expect was that apart from the general flag of the Legion of Devils and his own general flag of the neutral camp, this nine-headed demon dragon actually had a broken general flag of the Megalosaurus army. If he had not stopped here, this Daramar might have really achieved something. At the very least, he would have become one of the candidates for the final overlord. Keys objectively evaluated his enemy. Although his opponent had already died miserably, the young blue dragon did not underestimate him at all. I underestimated him before, but I don't know how many participants like him are hidden in Stim's game. The sound of gears meshing and springs returning to their original position interrupted Keys' reverie. A brand new clockwork Megalosaurus began to condense its body. Under the protection of eternal ice, the explosion just now did not harm the phantom dragon hidden in the legendary construct. When they recovered from their shock, they immediately began to use the legendary ability to repair the clockwork Megalosaurus. Ding! Killed the nine-headed demon dragon in a sneak attack. The mission Phantom Dragon's Request has been identified. The reward is being issued. Ding! The Spectre Dragons will is bound to the Clockwork Dragon. Once the game ends, players can freely take it away. It was a familiar feeling. It wasn't a notification sound, but rather a divine power fluctuation that he had sensed before. It was coming from the Clockwork Dragon. Upon contact, Keys could feel it. He began, try to learn something. He divine power, demon divine, and divine, it disappear. Just as he had the epiphany, the elusive god of virtual games had used his divine power to modify the Clockwork Dragon. The effects produced by divine power were, of course, extraordinary. The clockwork megalosaurus had a completely new appearance. If it had been crude before, it now looked like a meticulously molded figurine. Not only that, but thanks to the omnipotent divine power, this legendary construct's body structure had also been optimized. Originally, the clockwork megalosaurus's body structure was slightly bloated due to some of its creators' lingering thoughts about multi-riveted steamed steel. However, under the improvement of divine power, many unnecessary parts were removed without hesitation, vanishing without a trace. The multi-stroke engine that had been abandoned by Moradin, the core power unit of the clockwork megalosaurus, had been greatly improved. At least it was no longer an abandoned, defective product and would no longer malfunction easily. Apart from optimization and completion, the most obvious modification effect of divine power was that it had provided the clockwork megalosaurus with a second power system out of thin air. Previously, even though the clockwork megalosaurus had the specter dragon's assistance and energy supply, at the end of the day, it was still the power of magic that drove its movements. If it were to enter the realm of death magic, or a positive energy plane that was more restrained against the specter dragon, its energy efficiency would probably be greatly reduced. Without energy to drive its body, even if the clockwork megalosaurus was not a pile of scrap metal, it was just a good for show to scare people. The second power system provided by divine power, the use of fuel to power the multi-stroke engine, had made up for this flaw for the clockwork megalosaurus. As long as there was enough black oil as fuel, the clockwork megalosaurus would still be able to maintain sufficient combat power and fight without hindrance, even in places that could be regarded as forbidden zones for traditional construct life forms. This is really a pleasant surprise. After learning about this improvement, Keyes could not help but feel a little excited. He had previously obtained a magical item called Olamoki's Bucket of Waste. As long as he offered some precious metals and gemstones, he would be able to exchange a large amount of black oil from the Earth elemental plane. Therefore, even if the clockwork megalosaurus had become a big oil consumer, the young blue dragon was still not worried. After all, it had oil in its hands, and it was the kind that carried it everywhere. There were 2 flowers, 1 branch on each side. While Keyes was still calmly accepting his reward, the battle between the blood-armored demon army and the Buffett clan had already reached its climax. Although the general flag that Daramar had seized from the burnt sacrifice demon was quickly taken into the hands of Keyes, the sudden change in commander had still weakened the morale of the Batsu army. Under the powerful surprise attack of the demon lord, the formation that had been struggling to hold on could no longer hold on. Many of the blood-armored demons even wanted to retreat from the battlefield for the first time to avoid the ferocious Tauren in front of them. Beep! The blood-armored demon army's morale has dropped. If it reaches a certain level, there may be dispersal, mutiny, or other unfavorable situations. The familiar notification sounded, waking the young blue dragon from his daydream and alerting him to the situation on the battlefield. All troops retreat. Provide cover fire. After thinking for a moment, Keyes gave his first order to the devils he'd just taken over. With the approval of their commander, the blood-armored demons felt as if they'd been pardoned. They decisively abandoned their defensive formation and began to use their powerful spells. Because they'd used a large amount of dimensional interference before, the space on the battlefield had been disrupted. Only the blood-armored demons within the army could use their companions as coordinates and alternately use spatial spells. As for Buffett, even though he was a powerful demon lord, he still couldn't compare to the Legion of Devils in this aspect. Cowardly little devils! The beast lord roared angrily, his eyes darting around in an attempt to find a few punching bags on the battlefield to vent his anger. Buffett saw the pit fiend that he'd been wary of before. It seemed to be advancing instead of retreating, spreading its wings and rushing towards him. Let me test your capabilities. Looking at the great devil that seemed to be provoking him, Buffett's battle intent surged, and his desire to kill exploded. Chapter 420. Finally, we have a competent commander. Back on the walls of the stronghold, the captain of the blood-armored fiends reassessed the situation and made a fair assessment. Although the demon's definition of loyalty was, at most, directed towards the implementation of the Bartholomew's concept of orderly evil. However, having served an incompetent commander like Dalamar, the blood-armored fiends were more inclined to approve of this new commander. After all, he wasn't just a powerful pit fiend, although he wasn't, but someone who could decisively charge to the front lines to fight against a powerful demon lord, bringing up the rear for the retreating troops. Quickly prepare the glory of Bader. If necessary, we need to reinforce the commander, the captain hurriedly ordered. The so-called glory of Bator was similar to the burning explosion of the Baylor demons. It was a secret technique of the blood-armored demon army. Every blood-armored fiend army had to have such a structure. There was no lack of devout worshippers of the 9 prisons of Bader. When fighting against the demons, the blood-armored fiends could pick out the most fanatical of them and give them a noble mission. There was no need for persuasion or bluffing. They only needed to tell the blood-armored fiend that they would contribute everything to Bader and clear an obstacle. The blood-armored fiend would gladly accept. Then, under the praise of the blood-armored fiends, he would evolve into a blood-armored berserk fiend. He was far more dangerous than an ordinary blood-armored fiend, especially to the demons he fought against. From the moment a blood-armored fiend was born until it turned into ashes, it would always remain in the state of unparalleled inferno. They would forget all pain, charging towards the demons, fighting against the blood-armored fiends with bloodshot eyes. Even if they were injured, they wouldn't make a sound. Every time their spears pierced their targets, they would deal twice the damage as before. What was even more outrageous was that when a blood-armored fiend received a fatal blow, it would enter a temporary state of unparalleled. Even if it died immediately, the blood-armored fiend would still be able to close in on its opponent with the support of this state. Just like how an ordinary blood-armored fiend could explode with a maggot explosion, the blood-armored fiend would also explode upon death. And it was even more intense. The explosion after the blood-armored berserk demon's death was even more terrifying than the Baylor's incineration explosion. The maggots that emerged from its body would also inherit the characteristics of its host. They would also become explosive items that could be triggered easily. When a blood-armored berserk demon died, the maggots would quickly surge out of its corpse. It would not be long before it turned into a minefield that was about to explode. In order to create a blood-armored berserk demon, each blood-armored demon legion could only conduct a selection once a month. This selection was guaranteed to succeed. However, because Daramar was too unpopular, the blood-armored demons under his command did not have the resolve to die for him. However, whether it was Keyes' appearance as a pit fiend or his courage in facing Buffett alone, the blood-armored fiend approved of him. The selection ceremony went smoothly. All the blood-armored demons signed up enthusiastically, as if they were ready to die for their bosom friends. All the blood-armored demons who signed up emitted special energy waves. Through the ceremony, they communicated with the origin of Bardo. Not long after, the final result was revealed. The energy waves on the other blood-armored demons gradually dissipated, leaving only one blood-armored demon. It was wrapped in red energy like a waterfall, although it did not grow much taller. Its physique had become much stronger. Its tangled and swollen muscles burst through the armor on its body. Every steel nail on its body seemed to have been carefully polished. They had become sharp, and the rust had disappeared. That Minotaur, the guard captain extended his arm and pointed at the target for the blood-armored berserk demon, is Bardo's great enemy. There was no need for further words. Just the words Bardo's great enemy was enough to drive the blood-armored berserk demon into a frenzy. It wanted to tear apart the Minotaur's body immediately. With a whoosh, the blood-armored berserk demon leapt down from the city wall like an arrow leaving a bow. It broke into a run and ran towards the battlefield. Only after running halfway did it think of using a greater teleportation spell. At this moment, Keyes and Buffett were already engaged in a fierce battle. Clang, clang, clang. In just a moment, the young Blue Dragon and the Beast Monarch had clashed several times with their weapons. Sparks kept sputtering outwards, but both sides of the battle were unaffected. Keyes had just picked up the Dragonhead Warhammer that Dalamar had dropped. After testing it a little, he chose to use it as his weapon. The animated Warhammer, which would have attacked its master, seemed to have sensed that its user was a powerful, true dragon. It became extremely obedient. When Keyes and Buffett clashed with their weapons, the Dragonhead Warhammer would always take the initiative to attack, biting and capturing the opponent's machete. It's really a handy weapon. Trying to communicate with the Warhammer in his hand using his psionic ability, the young blue dragon took the initiative to send a compliment as a form of encouragement. After receiving the compliment, the Dragonhead Warhammer worked even harder. When Keyes swung it, it even gave its user a hand. Because he used the Warhammer, with Keyes' progress in the Nine Sword catalog, he could only use the martial arts of the Stone Dragon sect for the time being. This sect focused on the use of power, and defense relied on the connection with the earth. Stone Dragon sect, immovable mountain. Keyes' legs were like cast iron as he stood firmly on the ground. Even though the Beast Monarch's power couldn't be underestimated, it still couldn't knock him down to the ground with brute force. The recoil from every collision would follow Keyes' feet into the ground, and a large number of folds appeared on the ground around him. This was the essence of the Stone Dragon sect's martial arts. First put yourself in an invincible position, then start to defend and counterattack. It coincided with the battle philosophy of some legendary level warriors, focus on offense and defense. Stone Dragon sect, ancient mountain hammer. Knocking away Buffett's machete from bottom to top, Keyes used the momentum to raise the Dragonhead Warhammer above his head, and then smashed it down fiercely. Like a falling rock from a landslide, the Dragonhead Warhammer smashed into Buffett's face. But strangely, there wasn't the slightest sound of wind. The folds on the ground around him instantly disappeared, like a compressed spring, releasing the accumulated power to assist Keyes. Facing the incoming hammer, Buffett didn't have time to block it, so he chose to retreat. The young blue dragon naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity. In fact, the Stone Dragon sect also had a corresponding combo technique. Stone Dragon sect, earthquake. Keyes' heel slightly lifted and fell, and the ground under his feet seemed to have sensed it, immediately responding to the Stone Dragon warrior's suggestion. The ground suddenly shook, and Buffett, whose center of gravity shifted back, couldn't react in time, and his two hooves staggered. Chapter 4:21. Bang! Moo! The Warhammer accurately hit Buffett's face. The Tauren King's nose was broken, and he instantly let out a tragic howl. Rock Dragon style, bone-crushing force. The terrifying force passed through Keyes' Dragonhead Warhammer, not only crushing the flesh, but also the bones in the injured area. This was the secret martial art of the Rock Dragon sect. Its effect was far from as simple as harming the body, especially for a demon lord. Originally, relying on his own body and various self-healing abilities, Buffett could recover quickly even though he was severely injured. However, under the attack of the secret martial art of the Rock Dragon style, he was surprised to find that there seemed to be a special force hindering his recovery. Even though the bleeding had stopped and the bones had healed, the Beast Monarch's nose was still irreversibly deformed. "What did you do?" Buffett roared angrily. Because of his collapsed nose, his words sounded a little muffled. Keyes naturally wouldn't tell him that in order to get rid of this deformed state, he had to cut off the injured area and heal it again. Raising his warhammer, the young blue dragon stepped forward. If you want to know why, he just had to take a few more hits. Seeing the enemy approaching, Buffett hurriedly spat out a stream of water full of negative energy in an attempt to stop Keyes from attacking at close range. But because of his collapsed nose, the stream of water he spat out was deflected and perfectly avoided the target. The Beast Monarch, who was both shocked and angry, raised the machete in his hand. "I will take your life today. Your soul will give me the answer." Rock Dragon style, giant spirit possession. The Dragonhead Warhammer drew a wide and deadly arc with indescribable power, as if it was being used by a giant, and swung towards Buffett's machete. Among the various martial arts of the Stone Dragon sect that combined both offense and defense, This move, Titanic Spirit Possession, was one of the few offensive techniques that could be used in a wide-open manner. Only a martial arts master who had mastered the rock dragon style could swing his weapon in this way without losing his balance. Keyes practiced the nine-sword catalog diligently every day. Although he didn't become bald, he still became stronger and more familiar with using martial arts techniques. Ding! At an ingenious angle, the sharp horn of the dragon head war hammer collided with the blade of the machete, swinging it away from the side. The animated dragon head hammer seemed to understand its master's intentions. It cooperated with him and turned its angle, smashing into Buffett's wrist. With the previous lesson, Buffett immediately turned his arm into adamantine in order to prevent his wrist from being smashed and deformed. In this way, even if Keyes managed to attack the Tyrant King's wrist, he would only be able to break open some of the adamantine skin. However, this was enough. Rock Dragon style, Dragon's Tooth. After his arm had turned into adamantine, his agility had been greatly reduced. The stone spikes that suddenly rose from the ground caught him off guard. Under Keyes' control, the tip of the stone spike was not aimed at Buffett's body, but at the handle of the weapon in his hand. Zila, the handle of the machete, clashed violently with the adamantine palm, and in the end, the machete was sent flying. Buffett had lost his weapon. Keyes raised the dragon head warhammer, and the animated hammerhead popped out, catching the handle of the machete in the nick of time. Ironheart style, lightning throw. The warhammer was connected to the machete, and like a strangely shaped flail, it shot towards Buffett's face. The same attack, impossible. The beast monarch raised his adamantine arm to protect his face, but Keyes' attack was not what he thought it would be. The flail did not even touch Buffett's arm. The machete and the dragon head warhammer swayed for a moment, then rushed towards the real target. The horns on top of Buffett's head. The machete, which was ridiculously sharp, fiercely chopped into the original owner's horns, cutting almost half of its depth. The warhammer that came after completed the machete's unfinished work. It smashed into the broken horns and completely broke them. To be honest, this attack did not bring much pain to Buffett, but the humiliation it brought was even greater than before. The Horn King with a broken horn was even more embarrassing for the Demon Lord than the Beast Monarch with a flat nose. You will die without a doubt. Hot air spurted out from his collapsed nostrils, and Buffett, whose eyes were filled with blood, lowered his head and charged at Quith with his horns extended. Since his opponent did not have a weapon in his hands, he could use his horn to pierce through the body of this abominable pit fiend. However, he did not know that in the Nine Swords Manual, there's a fighting style that specialized in throwing techniques. Keyes had also practiced it before. Twilight Flow, Mobile Defense. Keyes began to shift, switching from the rock-like rock dragon style footwork to the similarly powerful yet rhythmic Twilight Flow movement. He was in a mysterious yet extremely logical state. Not only did he dodge the Minotaur Monarch's attack, he even found an opportunity to launch a counterattack. Twilight Flow, Stellar Transposition. One hand tightly gripped Buffett's remaining sharp horn, while the other knocked away his opponent's arm. His fingers dug into the gaps between his ribs, and he twisted his waist and sucked in his abdomen. Keyes led the Minotaur Monarch in a circle and threw him heavily onto the ground. Just like transplanting rice, half of Buffett's body was planted into the ground of the acid fog canyon. The strength he had just mustered was all converted by Keyes' stellar transposition and used on himself. Of course, even if he did all this, Keyes did not have the upper hand in this battle. In fact, at the same time that he threw the Minotaur Monarch, the young blue dragon had also been kicked by his hooves. Asterisk bang. Asterisk, a muffled sound similar to when a stick hits soaked leather. A large bruise appeared on Keyes' abdomen. The sudden pain made him involuntarily suck in a breath of cold air and let out a soft hiss. Taking advantage of this moment, Buffett used his silent casting ability to cast a gigantism spell on himself. After his gigantism, the Minotaur Monarch immediately broke free from the ground. He shook his dizzy head slightly, but even so, this demon lord who had experienced hundreds of battles still used a rather rational tactic. Labyrinth. There were no supreme magic techniques, no superfluous spells. As this spell was invented by Buffett, it was almost impossible to be immune to the labyrinth spell. Without exception, Keyes was immediately banished and temporarily dragged into the endless labyrinth under the Minotaur monarch's jurisdiction. Damned little devil, let me add some seasoning for you. Buffett's labyrinth spell took effect, but he knew that his labyrinth could only trap the enemy temporarily. That crafty pit fiend might have some method to escape quickly. He had to immediately communicate with his own kingdom and mobilize the various monsters in the endless labyrinth to suppress the banished Keyes. However, you are Bateau's great enemy. Chapter 422. Being suddenly banished by the maze spell was obviously out of Keyes' expectation, but he was not the only one who was shocked on the battlefield. With a howl, the blood-armored berserk demon launched a ferocious attack, catching Buffett off guard. Whoosh! The hell spear cut through the air. Because the machete was not in his hand, the beast monarch could only dodge, but at the same time, he reached out and grabbed the tip of the spear. Bang! Bang! Almost at the same time, the two large monsters used their clenched fists to hit each other. However, Buffett was a demon lord after all, and he had the upper hand in terms of strength. His hooves only took half a step back. The blood-armored mad demon was sent flying, half of his chest had been hammered into mush, and even a few ribs were protruding out, piercing through his skin. Bah! Buffett spat twice and wiped his fist. Then he raised the spear that he had snatched and threw it at the new opponent with all his might. The hell spear pierced through the blood-armored mad demon and nailed him to the wet and loose ground of the acid fog canyon. I'll grant you death, weak demon. With a disdainful, sarcastic remark, Buffett stepped forward, wanting to stomp the enemy who overestimated himself to death. However, the blood-armored mad demon did not struggle. He did not even want to escape. Instead, he opened his arms and tightly hugged Buffett's hoof and thigh that fell heavily on him. The blood-armored mad demon was never afraid of death. In fact, they were even eagerly looking forward to this moment. Because only at this moment, the meaning of this demon's existence could be maximized. Thou art the enemy of Bateau. Even if he coughed up some pieces of his internal organs, the blood-armored mad demon had to say this sentence again. This sentence was very important to him. Ah, are you begging for mercy? Yes, I am the enemy of Bateau. I am the nightmare of the Batsu people. Buffett was not omniscient nor omnipotent. He had never seen the blood-armored mad demon before, so he naturally did not know the temperament of this demon. As he admitted something in a sarcastic tone, he used his hooves to stomp the heart of his defeated opponent into pieces. However, a shocking turn of events suddenly occurred. Under the trampling of the hooves, the blood-armored mad demon had turned into a pile of mush, but the mush once again climbed onto the opponent's body. Like maggots attached to the bone, the mush covered Buffett's body, and some even went into his nostrils and mouth. The beast monarch naturally would not be indifferent. In fact, he had already added a protective layer of negative energy on the surface of his body. However, just as he was about to detonate the negative energy barrier and remove all the rotten flesh, the blood-armored dire fiend's enhanced version of rotten maggot explosion was one step ahead of him. The mushes is his bodies is his. S's. There's of S's of stace. SS's SSS was of his, not a single bit was wasted. Although the sound of the series of explosions was not very deafening, the several feet of land at the center of the explosion was enough to prove how powerful the maggot explosion after the death of the blood-armored mad demon was. Even with the beast monarch's strong physique, he still couldn't escape unscathed from such a violent explosion. His strong body was covered in black fur, and smoke kept coming out of it after the explosion. Buffett relied on his strong willpower to support himself and not fall to the ground. It's finally over. This damn day. The beast monarch's ears were still ringing with the buzzing caused by the explosion, but his mutterings were not obstructed at all and directly reached his slightly shaken heart. Even though he knew that although he was seriously injured, his powerful recovery ability was still working resolutely. He only needed to wait a little longer, and he would be able to recover his lost life. Even though he sensed that his beloved machete was actually thrown away not far away, as long as he walked over and picked up his weapon, he would once again have a suffocating combat power. But his heart was trembling. Demons had never been brave. Even a strong demon lord was at most a little more brutal than an ordinary demon. And this was not a rootless duckweed. The more brutal and savage a demon lord was, the more he needed to have the strength to match it. Just now, Buffett deeply felt the threat of death. For a moment, he was really worried that he would fall. Although he was only a clone of the real beast monarch, it was obviously not worth it to waste it in the acid fog canyon. He wanted to retreat. If he didn't retreat now, the blood-armored mad demon's army would probably not give him a chance to recover. Bonitaz, Buffett began to summon his mount, wanting to call the colossal bull demon to leave with him. As the creator of Bonitaz, he was very clear on how much resources he had spent on the colossal bull demon. It had been heavily injured by the Hydra and lost its heart. At most, it could only fall into a state of suspended animation to protect itself. According to Buffett's estimation, at least half of Bonitaz's injuries should have disappeared by now. However, he did not receive a reply to his call. Even the unique soul undulations of Bonitaz that he could feel just now seemed to have disappeared in an instant. At the same time, in the distance of this battlefield, in an unremarkable suitcase, an alarm clock rang out. With a series of creaking sounds, the Megalosaurus turned from a suitcase into a door, a light blue curtain of light enshrouding it. "You're finally back." Keys, still in his pit fiend form, stepped out of the door. When he had recognized Buffett, the young blue dragon had paid extra attention to prevent him from using the maze spell. After all, the maze spell used by this demon lord was something that even weaker gods could not avoid. However, even though Keys had left accurate spatial coordinates on the Megalosaurus body in advance, and with the help of a natural connection with his own creation, he still had to stay in the endless maze for a while before finding a way out. Fortunately, Keys had returned in time. "Fortunately, you didn't leave." The young blue dragon suddenly smiled at Buffett. "Otherwise, if I sent out an invitation to a feast and didn't prepare enough food in the end, I wouldn't be a good host." As if in response to his words, a loud howl suddenly sounded from the corpse of the colossal bull demon Bonitaz. Below not counted in the word count. Thanks to Shouting 246, Ordovision Radiation, Stargazing 1996, Taishang Shun E, and the Super Fire-Breathing Dragon for their tips. The newbie author once again thanks everyone for their support and love. Chapter 423. The gigantic colossal bull demon turned into food for a group of hungry beasts and died silently on the battlefield of the acid fog canyon. At this moment, Buffett finally understood why his mount didn't respond to his call. Bonitaz was dead. As the howl rang out, his muscular body suddenly collapsed. Holes began to appear on the corpse of this powerful Tata re-fiend. The beasts that killed or devoured the colossal bull demon's flesh were like moths breaking out of their cocoons, drilling out from the surface of its body. Their bodies were soaked in the filthy demon's blood, and their sharp teeth were exposed as if they were telling what they had just eaten. What was most unacceptable to Buffett was that although these ferocious beasts had dragon-like heads, their bodies seemed to be more like jackals. That was the appearance of creatures he hated the most. For thousands of years, he had even slaughtered countless Knoll tribes with his own hands. The creatures that looked like jackals always reminded him of his old rival, Yeenagu, who was always against Buffett. Could it be that these guys are related to that Knoll? Or could it be that this game is just a scam by Stim? Demons were never afraid to speculate about others with the most vicious thoughts, and the Demon Lord was one of the best. As soon as he saw the Yazzie that looked like a jackal, Buffett began to imagine wildly. He even began to suspect that the god of virtual games, Stim, inviting him here was an important part of another scam, and now he had fallen into the trap of his old rival. Of course, this had nothing to do with Keys. The Yazzie was a magical beast that he had indirectly created. It was a powerful monster that was born from the remains of the Leviathan spawn that was killed by the demon worm. As early as a few months ago, after Keys had a fierce battle with Helmuter, the incarnation of the tyrant worm that had descended to the ash world. He had conveniently thrown it into the abyss to hunt demons. At that time, because of this action, Keyes had also received a gift from the Abyss Will and obtained a treasure that was enough to make the Demon Lord-level demons covet. A few days ago, when he returned to the acid Fog Canyon Bitwall, he actually felt a familiar call from the unseen world. Moreover, compared to the Yazi that had been thrown into the abyss before, this magical beast had multiplied into a group. They wandered in the abyss in groups, hunting the Dakri demons all day long and eating them as their own food. Because they had taken root in the abyss, the Yazi had now evolved into an abyssal creature. The Yazi's ability to hide all or part of its body in the astral plane had also undergone a corresponding change. It had become a plane covered by the power of chaos, and there was no restriction. This way, even if Stim blocked the acid Fog Canyon plane and temporarily used it as his own gaming ground, he could not stop Quest from summoning the Yazis in. However, Keyes could summon the Yazi, but it did not mean that he could make them work for him. In fact, except for the first Yazi beast, which was an indirect creation of the young blue dragon and would spontaneously revere its creator, the other Yazi could only restrain themselves from attacking Keyes under the orders of their ancestors. If he wanted them to be obedient, he had to give them some benefits. As the saying went, the kindness of a meal must be repaid, and the grievance of a Yazi must be avenged. This was the nature of this race, and Keyes naturally knew it. When he saw the seriously injured Penotus lying on the ground, the young blue dragon had a plan in his mind. He began to call the Yazi to come to the banquet. The appetizer of the banquet was naturally the giant bull demon. After eating this daiquiri, the Yazi immediately responded more enthusiastically to Keyes' orders. After all, by eating powerful demons, they did indeed benefit a lot. Stretching out his finger and pointing at Buffett, who was glaring at him, Keyes ordered the Yazi, "That will be your banquet." Hearing this, the Yazi not only did not resist, but many of them even drooled. The more powerful the demon was, the more to their appetite. Even if the other party was a demon lord, the Yazi would not back down at all. This was an instinct when facing food. Without any more words, Keyes gave the target, and the Yazi swarmed up and rushed crazily toward Buffett. The beast monarch, who had just recovered from the damage caused by the blood-armored mad demon's maggot explosion and the shock, the latter was more than the former, fell into a great panic again. He could not understand why a monster of the abyss species could ignore the aura of a demon lord and wantonly show its sharp teeth to him. "You jackals were only fit to eat carrion." A dangerous light flashed in Buffett's eyes. "You are really a damned race." Always paying attention to the game he had set up and observing the process of the game participants fighting for the ultimate overlord, Stim couldn't help but feel a little speechless after seeing the encounter of the nine-headed demon dragon Daramar and the Tauren King Buffett. The two of them were obviously closed beta users. Even if the game was really online, Stim still took care of them. Not only did he arrange for them to develop in relatively good conditions, but they were also not like the commanders in Bateau's camp who had to be harshly exploited at all times and were in a predicament of not being able to make ends meet at all times. But now, these two closed beta users were forced to such a state by the same game participant on the same day. One had completely canceled his game account, and the other was on the verge of being forced to disconnect. If it was for his own benefit, Stim needed to try his best to ensure that Buffett could be the ultimate winner of this game. After all, he had already made a Styx oath before that after the game. He would give the priesthood related to the maze to the beast monarch. At that time, the game's reward and this oath that needed to be fulfilled could be mixed together, and he would be able to pass the game by deceiving his way through. But who would have thought that a talented game participant like Keyes would suddenly appear? And his actions, whether it was using a large amount of game gold coins or building a boomtown to help him work hard, were actually in line with the core of the priesthood of virtual games. Not only was Stim unable to develop any ill feelings toward him, he even considered whether to give him some small gifts after the game was over. But if he did not deal with Keyes now, then after the game was over, he was afraid that he would have to bleed once. The dignified god of virtual games was actually dragged into a dilemma by the game he had set up. Sure enough, mud can't support a wall. Looking at Buffett's current situation, Stim thought helplessly. Chapter 424. Classmate Telemus. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Stym uttered a common greeting in the abyss to express his dissatisfaction with his dilemma. Those new monsters seem to be existences outside the game. Their intrusion has disrupted the balance of the game. Suddenly, he had an idea. He thought of a way to weaken Keys without violating his priesthood. Banishing those monsters will affect the balance of the game. Just as Stym was about to put his idea into practice, an obscure yet unprecedentedly powerful will suddenly descended. The will of the abyss. In a split second, the dwarf god's heart shook violently. He really did not expect, and was even more unwilling to think that he would one day be watched by the true ruler of the bottomless abyss. Now, Stym only had the intention to banish Yazzie, but he was warned before he could actually carry it out. If he really did banish Yazzie, it might trigger the hostility of the will of the abyss, as well as crazy and vicious revenge. No one dared to underestimate the will born from the origin of the bottomless abyss, not even the gods with great divine power. The chaotic and evil power contained in the bottomless abyss could even trace back to the incarnations of the gods and directly destroy their divine kingdom. Moreover, in order to set up a game that encompassed an entire plane, Stym had now descended into the bottomless abyss with his original body. The will of the abyss only had to think, and the demons living in the various planes of the abyss would come in droves to fight Stym to the death in an endless stream. In fact, in order to gain the favor of the will of the abyss, those powerful demon lords might even come for a share of the pie. Stym knew that he was not that stubborn, and his small body could not withstand the ravages of the various big bosses of the bottomless abyss. Fortunately, he came to his senses in time. In fact, the moment the will of the abyss appeared, all the demon lords of the bottomless abyss had a realization at the same time. They could feel that in the power of the origin of the abyss, a strong will to destroy something had already taken shape. If Stym had not stopped his actions in time and repeatedly showed weakness to that will, perhaps many powerful demon lords would have already walked out of the portal and sent their final greetings to him. After all, destroying a god that the will of the abyss viewed as an enemy, and this god wasn't that powerful, was too tempting for the demon lords who dreamed of becoming demon princes. A strong sense of defeat, an inexplicable sense of grievance, suppressed anger, all sorts of emotions surged in Stym's heart. A god who was in charge of games could not even adjust the balance of the game. What were those monsters that looked like dragon-headed jackals? Were they related to the investors? Of course, complaining was just complaining. Now, even if Heironi's courage was transplanted into Stym's body, he would not dare to make a move against Yazzie. He didn't even dare to think about it. However, why would the will of the abyss protect a creature like Yazzie? This was actually related to the great wish they had made at the beginning of their birth. The Yazzie was born from a derivative of Leviathan that had been devoured by a demon worm. They were born to take revenge on the demon. The ultimate goal of all the Yazzies was the same. They wanted to devour all the demons in the bottomless abyss as much as possible. In the current bottomless abyss, although the demons of Tana were prosperous, their existence itself was extremely contradictory, especially those demon lords. Even if they ruled their own kingdoms with evil and violence, a kingdom was a kingdom. The emergence of classes meant the invasion of the power of order, and the more powerful a demon lord was, the longer they could rule, and the more solidified the classes in their kingdoms. As the origin of chaos and evil, the will of the bottomless abyss naturally hated any order, even those demon lords who were favored by it. The appearance of the Yazzie seemed to be a correction of the power of chaos against the power of order for the bottomless abyss. Although they wanted to devour all the demons and destroy the demon race, what did that have to do with the will of the abyss? Demons, the old playthings of the will of the abyss, had actually been abandoned by it. and destruction. Even if the target was a demon, the will of the abyss appreciated this behavior. That was why the will of the abyss deliberately took care of the Yazi and gave them the ability of chaotic transition to facilitate their predation on demons. Stim had previously thought that the sudden transition to the plane of the acid fog canyon was a kind of violation of the rules of the game. They had to be expelled to maintain the balance of the game. However, it was precisely this idea of his that led to the arrival of the will of the abyss. Because he thought that the Yazi could not and should not appear in the plane of the acid fog canyon. This idea in itself was a denial of the will of the abyss. This dwarf god had actually been on the blacklist of the bottomless abyss, and countless conspiracies had already been created around him. Although the will of the abyss seemed to have calmed down now, no matter what Stim did, he was actually taking a step forward on the road of destruction. Unless he immediately fled the bottomless abyss and found a place where the power of order flourished to seek refuge, the outcome of his destruction was already set. Stim was still too young. Even though he had lived for some years as a god, he still could not understand the nature of the bottomless abyss. He did not escape immediately. He was still paying attention to his game, trying to use a more reasonable method to deal with the problem. Yazi, this kind of person who has relations with the abyss, cannot be targeted at the moment. With his legs crossed, Stim half reclined on the throne of his tyrant worm palace. He pointed at the few screens in front of him. But those worm demons of the neutral camp are also products of the bottomless abyss. There's nothing wrong with strengthening them. Moreover, Stim suddenly thought of something. After farming in the wilderness for so long, the players have not encountered the great dragon yet. Perhaps its hiding place is too remote. I have to give them a reminder. Moreover, the progress of the game is too slow at the moment. If we give those players who have the talent for farming too much time to develop, won't they flatten everything in the end? That won't do. We have to force them to encounter each other in the early stages and compete fiercely with each other. Add a poison circle. After all, the god of virtual games was the god of virtual games. As long as Stim was willing to think, he could come up with countless new ideas on how to improve the game every second. Dragon, poison circle. Many ideas were born in his mommy lie's little head. As for the specific operation, time halt. Stim used his divine power to cast his psionic ability. All the creatures in the Overlord game were suddenly frozen for a day. Except for the Yazi that he deliberately ignored and the young blue dragon that was obviously related to it. This also caused Buffett, who was fighting with the Yazi, to suddenly become motionless under Keys's surprised gaze. Chapter 425. To others, Stim's psychic ability could perfectly fulfill his wishes, but not to a demon lord. In fact, Buffett quickly broke free from the effect of time stop, but it still took him half an hourglass to do so. And this was undoubtedly fatal, especially when he was facing a group of hungry Yazis and the young blue dragon who wouldn't let go of any opportunity. Despicable and shameless dwarf. This king of beasts didn't have a single piece of good flesh left. Dense scars covered his entire body. That was the result of the Yazi's gnawing and the demon lord's strong recovery. What made him even more terrified was that his own machete that had the effect of stopping his wounds from healing was now stuck in his chest. A big hole was torn in his heart. Dong, dong, dong. Keys, who was unforgiving, had already put Buffett on the ground. He held the remaining bullhorn in his hand and swung the dragon head war hammer, continuously hammering on the huge bull head. The Yazi beasts buried their heads. Some continued to gnaw on the king of beasts' limbs, tearing apart his tendons that were constantly healing. Some aimed at his abdomen and the rat's throat, picking the softer parts to bite. To be honest, this was the first time Buffett felt that his super regenerative ability and his strong spiritual power that could quickly break free from the effect of Stim's psychic ability were a complete mistake. As a strong demon lord, from the moment he was born, he had always been the one who took the initiative to torture his opponents. Only this time, he was pressed on the ground by the enemy and tortured back and forth inhumanely. That feeling was worse than death. It wasn't that Buffett didn't think of resisting. but his tendons and tendons were constantly being torn apart by the Yazi. His muscles couldn't even muster up any strength. He wanted to use spells, even those that were as simple as eating and drinking. Under Key's relentless hammering and casting physical stun, he couldn't even form a complete thought. Other than when he just broke free from the effect of time stop, Buffett cursed him. After that, he couldn't even speak a complete sentence. However, Keyes was equally depressed. Why is this guy's head so hard? Even though the young blue dragon had amazing physical strength, where he smashed half an hourglass with a hammer like a pile driver, the recoil from the hammer still made his wrist feel a little sore. The only thing that made Quest gratified was that due to his continuous beating and the Yazi beast horde's continuous devouring, Buffett's body was constantly shrinking, even though he had a heaven-defying physical body recovery ability. As his body healed again and again, this evil demon lord's body was constantly shrinking. This beast monarch's body had already changed from the size of a small mountain to the size of an ordinary minotaur. Thinking of the opportunity to personally hammer and kill a demon lord, Keyes' heart was once again ignited with motivation to support the work at hand. Nothing in this world is difficult, the young blue dragon encouraged himself. However, the next moment, he turned the already sluggish minotaur and warned fiercely, "As long as you are willing to give up." Like a sudden clap of thunder, Buffett, who had closed his eyes and stopped listening, suddenly understood something. His crooked mouth revealed a mocking smile. Giving up is indeed a good idea. Immediately after, the tormented beast monarch incarnation, his eyes suddenly swelled, and his eyeballs began to spin. Damn, it can even work like this. Because he was worried that something unexpected would happen, Keyes couldn't help but speed up the hammering in his hand. More and more collapsed marks appeared on Buffett's hard skull. PFFF, the dragon head hammer smashed into one of the Minotaur King's eyes, but this eyeball didn't burst. Instead, it fell off with a rolling sound and was firmly embedded in the dragon's mouth of the hammerhead. Furthermore, Buffett's other eye seemed to have popped out of its socket due to the force of the hammer being transmitted. Keyes reached out to stop it, but this escaping eyeball immediately sped up and escaped the young blue dragon's grasp in a flash. After losing both of his eyes, Buffett's physical body suddenly collapsed. Even the muscles that were already in the mouths of the Yazi beast began to turn into lumps of smelly bubbles. Soul imprisonment. Keyes was actually quite familiar with some of the tricks of the demons, so he immediately launched a spell to stop Buffett's soul. At least, he couldn't let this beast monarch escape so easily. However, although the spell was effective, it didn't have any effect. The demon lord's soul had already escaped this domain. That eyeball. Immediately realizing where the problem was, Keyes immediately stood up and wanted to intercept Buffett's escaping eyeball. But at this moment, a thunderbolt suddenly fell from the sky of the acid fog canyon plain, and the sound of glass breaking abruptly rang out. With his superior vision, Keyes saw that the eyeball that was the size of an ordinary person's fist suddenly disappear into a black hole that suddenly appeared. It turned out that Buffett had indeed chosen to give up in the end. He used his demon lord incarnation to sacrifice to the bottomless abyss. The will of the abyss immediately gave this Minotaur King feedback and helped him tear apart the fence that Stim had set up. There is nothing difficult in this world, as long as you are willing to give up. I told you to give up resisting, not to give up this incarnation. The self-deprecating words sounded in Keyes' mind. The young blue dragon frowned and raised the dragon head hammer in his hand. Buffett's eye that was embedded in the hammerhead had also lost its vitality. It was like a black jade that was held in the mouth of the ferocious dragon head. I offended another demon lord. Keyes helplessly shrugged his shoulders. I only got a hammer in exchange. What a loss. Experiencing the frustration of its owner, the dragon head hammer suddenly made a buzzing sound, as if it wanted to prove itself. Following its noise, the machete that was stuck straight into the ground because Buffett's physical body had disappeared suddenly bounced up. The machete spun and slashed towards Keyes. The young blue dragon thought that this was the beast monarch's backup plan, and hurriedly raised his hammer to block. However, this machete wasn't actually attacking. At the last moment, when it came into contact with the dragon head hammer, it took the initiative to pass the hilt over. With a soft ding, the hilt was caught by the animated hammer, and once again formed a strange shape of a flail. Alright, I didn't get a hammer, but a second-hand flail that doesn't even look good. The animated hammerhead twisted its neck, and the machete suddenly disappeared into the buffet's eye in its mouth. It turned its head and looked at its user with sad eyes, as if it was questioning Keys. What right do you have to despise me? However, Keys didn't pay attention to it at this moment, because the Yazzie beast herd had already surrounded it in the center. They didn't want to attack, but the Yazzie ancestor that was indirectly created by the young blue dragon came out of the crowd, holding two of Buffett's horns in its mouth and excitedly asking for credit. Well done. Keep up the good work. Keys stroked the Yazzie ancestor's head with satisfaction to show his encouragement. The dragon head hammer was jealous. Chapter 426. After waiting for a long time, the game notification still didn't sound. Obviously, Stim didn't approve of Keys' action of defeating Buffett. The reward must have been cheated. Keys, who never had any hope for the character of game developers, couldn't help but secretly complain. However, now was not the time to reason with Stim, and the young blue dragon didn't have the strength to argue with the gods. Fortunately, after this powerful demon lord was killed, some things were left behind. The machete, broken horns, Buffett's eye, and the graveyard that it had used before. These things were now all ownerless. Stim was too lazy to deal with them, so they were abandoned on the battlefield for Keys to pick up. The graveyard can be left to Snader to deal with, and the horns of the Tauren King can also be used as materials for some magic items, but the machete and Buffett's I have now become part of the hammer. It's really a pity. Although Keys had used the dragon head war hammer as his weapon in the battle just now, it was indeed quite convenient for him to use it. But the young blue dragon was actually very clear that he had completely exposed his identity as a megalosaurus in front of the demon lord. Otherwise, transforming into a dragon's body would be a better way to fight and more suitable for facing a strong enemy. And when he transformed back into a megalosaurus, using a hammer as a weapon, it would really be like playing with a hammer, and it would most likely be a burden. Even a small hammer would be good. It could also be used when repairing the megalosaurus. It's a pity that such a good material would be wasted. Looking at the dragon head warhammer, Keys couldn't help but think of the fine gold longsword that he had left behind in the Ash World. That weapon was carefully made by the ogre weapon master, Naru, because it could no longer keep up with the young blue dragon's explosive strength. It had been reduced to a training tool. Compared to the fine gold longsword, the dragon head warhammer in front of him was undoubtedly made of better material. This could be seen from the fact that it didn't suffer any damage when it clashed with the demon lord's weapon. It was really a pity to let it sit idle and eat dust all year round. However, Keys had no way to give it to his companions. After all, he could feel that the dragon head warhammer had become a living creature. If it did not recognize the user, it would launch a merciless counterattack. As if sensing the will of its wielder, the dragon head warhammer seemed to have made up its mind. It began to vibrate with a buzzing sound. The incomparably hard hammerhead was now like mercury that could be molded at will, easily changing its appearance. "Small hand hammer," Keys exclaimed in surprise. Then, the dragon head warhammer changed again. Wrench, screwdriver, pliers, and hydraulic, file, chisel. The dragon head warhammer that constantly transformed itself into various metalworking items indeed delighted Keys. And its constant transformation to cater to his needs made Keys wonder if he had also encountered Nerodes. Of course, this change was good and acceptable. It could be beneficial to some of Keys's future plans. Therefore, Keys was not stingy with his praise at this time. What an amazing ability. It seems that I will have to use a versatile tool like you more often in the future. It's just that the young blue dragon hesitated for a moment and decided to remind the dragon head warhammer, pragmatism is the first principle. Although the multiverse is indeed a superficial society, as a tool, The patterns you just transformed into are too complicated. Once again, the Dragon Head Warhammer acutely understood the intention of its wielder. It began to become simple and unadorned. Finally, it turned into a hard-headed hammer that could be seen in any blacksmith shop. Nodding with satisfaction, Keyes did not put this weapon into his spatial equipment. Instead, he hung on his belt and carried it with him. On the inconspicuous corner of the hard-headed hammer, a small dragon had opened its mouth and revealed a satisfied smile. After dealing with his gains from the battle with Buffett, Keyes bade farewell to the excited Yazzie beasts and promised them that he would summon them in time if there was such a meal opportunity in the future. The Yazzie beasts that received the promise thanked the young blue dragon one after another. Then, they used the Chaos Transition ability to leave the Acid Fog Canyon. In addition, Keyes also needed to take over the demon fortress that had been assigned to him. However, when he saw that the blood-armored demon stationed in the fortress had fallen into a daze, he realized that the entire Acid Fog Canyon plain was shrouded in an inexplicable energy. This is time halt. After carefully identifying it for a while, he used the knowledge from the inheritance of the great sage of gizmos to recognize the super-large range of psionic ability that Stim had used. He could not help but sigh at this dwarf god's generosity. An ordinary psionic warlock could affect hundreds or thousands of people, which was already the limit. However, this god could actually use his own will to distort the time flow of an entire plane. It was really amazing. Why am I not affected? Key suddenly thought. And if it's because I also have the psionic ability and thus have a strong resistance to this kind of influence, then why are those Yazzie beasts not affected? Although the young blue dragon did not know that this was actually the result of the mediation of the super big boss, the will of the abyss, Keyes did not dwell on this question for too long. Because he immediately thought of another question: what is Stim doing this for? Keyes definitely did not believe that this dwarf god would use up so much divine power on a whim. That god of virtual games. He is stopping the server for an update. The young blue dragon made his own judgment based on the experience of his previous life. Perhaps it was because I defeated Buffett that caused Stim to have no choice but to do this. But what will he update? One question after another, like a ball of tangled hemp that had lost its thread, stuffed into Quest's mind. Perhaps it was the forward-looking wisdom of a creature like the Megalosaurus that caused him to give up on these questions in the end. Instead, he turned his thoughts to some more practical matters that needed to be solved urgently. After all, no matter what arrangement Stim had, it was actually his business. The best response was to make comprehensive preparations. Looking at the motionless demon fortress in front of him, Keyes thought quickly. A map marked with the various forces gradually formed in his mind. Suddenly, a burst of inspiration welled up in his mind. He looked at the clockwork Megalosaurus that was also in a state of stillness. The young blue dragon suddenly had an idea. Chapter 427. Stim's game update was announced to be completed in just one day, and all general flag holders received the notification at the same time. It was still the same familiar notification sound. Ding! The Overlord's glory has been updated and has resumed normal operation. All general flag holders, please take note that the game has changed as follows. A new mechanism has been added, Tide of Worms. After a period of recuperation, the tyrant worm that once ruled the plane of Acid Fog Canyon has returned. He will lead an uncountable number of worms and attack every commander's camp at random. Commanders can choose to stand their ground, but I don't recommend it. The tyrant worm is so angry, and its swarm is so hungry, so those commanders who choose to stand their ground will face more and more worms every once in a while. A more rational choice is actually to advance toward the final circle, which is the vicinity of the tyrant worm's palace in the Shattered Canyon. As the god of virtual games, I assure you that the tide of worms will only devour the commander's camp at the outermost perimeter. However, as you advance toward the final circle, the chances of you encountering each other will greatly increase, and this will undoubtedly make this competition more exciting. If you obtain enough general flags, you can even try to gather your forces and challenge the tyrant worm. Anyone who succeeds in the challenge will obtain the tyrant worm's treasure and plant a tide of worms against a competitor. Please believe me, this will definitely make it easier to become the Overlord. After listening to the lengthy and detailed introduction, all General Flag holders in Acid Fog Canyon took action. No one would sit still and wait for death. Buffett, who represented the forces of the bottomless abyss, had already left the game early. Other than the tyrant worm of the neutral camp, the other commanders were all great demons from the 9 prisons of Bader. As warlords, they joined the Blood War in order to obtain more benefits. It could be said that every Batsu commander was an expert in strategy and tactics, and had countless battle experience. However, these great demons had long been in the military system of Bader, and had long been used to relying on sturdy walls and reliable troops. When faced with Stim's friendly notification, they were even more used to seeing it as a trap. That guy definitely doesn't have good intentions. It's most likely that he wants to lure us out of the stronghold and then take us down one by one. This was the first instinct of many Batsu commanders, and their deduction that Stim was up to no good was correct. Thus, apart from a few great demons with smaller armies and strongholds that were practically undefended, the other Batsu commanders all chose to defend their strongholds. Their reverse thinking, their actions. As for the weaker Batsu commanders, they began to form unreliable alliances. Of course, such an alliance with the demons would at most guarantee that they wouldn't stab each other in the back. Other than that, it was better than nothing. You bunch of lazy bastards, hurry up and leave. Otherwise, I'll demote all of you to lowly inferior devils. Barbarian was a mighty pit fiend, but he was still very young. Before coming to Acid Fog Canyon, he'd just celebrated his 20,000th birthday. Counting from the time he'd fallen into the 9 hells, he'd used less than 20,000 years to rise from an ordinary petitioner to a pit fiend. He could be said to have extraordinary talent, and his progress was godly. To him, life in the 9 prisons of Bader was like a fish in water. However, it was precisely because he was too young that he lacked some accumulation. The number of troops under his command wasn't that great. The other Batsu commanders were mostly lords of Batsu who had their own land in Bader, and Barbarian was just an amateur. Stim's notification had just ended, and this crafty great devil contacted a group of amateur commanders in the expeditionary army that he was familiar with. They discussed an offensive and defensive alliance. Our forces are relatively weak, so we must unite and deal with this sudden crisis together. Tomorrow, we will join forces. You may choose to enter my reef stronghold, and its authority will be open to all of you. I, the commander of the 9 prisons of Bader, swear to the great sticks that all the resources in the reef stronghold will be shared with all of you tomorrow. This was Barbarian's promise to the other leaders of the smaller warlords. However, the moment the alliance was formed, he immediately ordered his troops to set out, leaving an empty city for his allies. Of course, he left behind a lesser demon, combined troops, a broken shield, resource sharing, and open all permissions, directly removing all the magic restriction and taking away the resources after collecting them. Haha, what an offensive and defensive alliance. Barbarian had been able to become a pit fiend in less than 20,000 years, relying on the framework of the laws to constantly screw over his allies. He had no qualms about this at all. As for whether or not his allies would settle the score with him in the future, that would have to wait until they dealt with the worm tide. The long caravan moved forward quickly, leaving behind deep wheel marks on the loose ground of the Acid Fog Canyon. The devils in charge of pulling the carts not only had to struggle to drag them along, they also had to turn back from time to time to clean up the ground. That fish face is spitting bubbles again. Hearing Barbarian's reprimand, a spiked devil thought to himself in disdain. There were many devils who shared the same attitude as him. Fish Face was the nickname the devils had given Barbarian. While Barbarian had advanced quickly due to his young age, he still retained some of the characteristics of his original race. He'd been to a few material planes where the sea was the main focus and had seen the Sharkman race. They'd given him the name Fish Face. Of course, most of the devils only mocked him in secret. Anyone who dared to call him that apart from the Devil Duke they'd sworn loyalty to, was already dead. The spiked devil pulling the carts left the carts by the side of the road, using its teleportation ability to return to the back of the caravan. It then followed the tracks of the carts, using its spiked claws to kick at them. "Do you need help?" A sentence in Infernal suddenly rang out in the spiked devil's ears. However, the tone was rather strange, and it couldn't help but look towards the source of the voice. Command, intimidate. The sudden activation of the spell left the spiked devil unable to dodge, and he was instantly dumbstruck. Chapter 428. The skies of the acid fog gorge were filled with thick smoke. From the direction it was coming from, it seemed like the submerged reef stronghold had been burnt down. The tide of worms, Basaril muttered to himself as he gazed at his former stronghold. At the same time, he felt proud of his wise decision. The reduced visibility did not affect the vision of the devils. This group hurriedly moved forward, not stopping for even a moment. Standing up from his carriage, the pit fiend brought a few of his blood-armored bodyguards to the back of the convoy. "They're still moving too slowly. I have to remind these lazy bastards. Find a spiked devil and demote it." Basaril pondered. He thought of a way to motivate his subordinates, and was about to put it into action immediately. However, perhaps today was the lucky day of an unlucky spiked devil. The pit fiend commander's plan did not come to fruition. Asterisk bang. Asterisk at the front of the convoy. A huge rock suddenly flew through the air, smashing into a barbed devil scout and turning it into minced meat. The entire convoy immediately stopped in their tracks. All the devils took up their weapons on their own accord, leaning against the carriages to get into a defensive formation. Basaril, who had just chosen a spiked devil and had yet to make a move, immediately teleported into the center of the defensive circle with his bodyguards. There seemed to be only one boulder that was thrown over, and there were no more boulders that came flying over. Basaril had originally thought that it was an alliance that was preparing to ambush him midway, but the current situation did not seem like something the devils would do. Could it be that bastard Taz trying to rob us? The pit fiend commander thought of this possibility and could not help but be speechless. In a land of chaos and evil, anything can happen. Actually, this cannot be blamed on him. After all, robbing a Batsu army was too outrageous. Even if this army only had a mere 100 devils, it was not something a small group of demons could match up to. Besides, demons were chaotic by nature, and most of them would not be able to commit crimes in groups. It was most likely that they would act alone. However, what happened next made Basaril feel even more astonished. What demon bandits? It was clearly just a few trolls. Who gave them the courage to attack him? Basaril's interest in his opponents was piqued. He could not even be bothered to give orders, and only glanced at his blood-armored bodyguards. "Get rid of those who block the way." The blood-armored demon bodyguard captain roared. The barbed demons who were acting as scouts rushed out. Although they didn't feel sorry for the death of one of their comrades, they were still prepared to use the cruelest methods to deal with the ogres to prove the strength of their race. After all, a useful devil was a good devil. "It's been a while." Blue the ogre patted his brother on the shoulder. "As usual, I'll attack first, then you attack." Nalu nodded. Brew opened his gourmet box and picked out a handful of iced mint leaves. He tossed them into his mouth and started chewing. The cold sensation stimulated the gourmet's mouth and taste buds. It resonated with his keen senses. Frost breath. He patted his belly, and a gust of cold wind burst out, howling as it enveloped the demon scout that was charging over. Then, as if he had thought of something, Brew stuffed some more pepper seeds into his mouth. The slight numbness stimulated the tip of his tongue. "Ma, bai chi, eat," paralyzing gaze. All the barbed demon scouts who made eye contact with Brew were instantly affected. Their movements became sluggish and deformed. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Blue the ogre, who couldn't hold back his desire for battle, pounced on the enemy in front of him. Nalu didn't use ebony spikes. Instead, he held 2 steam repeating crossbows in each hand and began his frenzied slaughter. Ordinary people couldn't even lift the steam repeating crossbows with both arms. However, In the hands of the ogre, who was much larger than his peers, they were like small handguns. It was effortless for him to hold one in each hand. Steam gushed out of the small steam boiler. Not only did it pull the bowstring taut, but it also rotated the rotating wheel that acted as the magazine. Do-do-do, do-do-do, do-do-do. Nalu only needed to aim. As long as he pulled the trigger, the steam-repeating crossbow would fire continuously until the magazine was exhausted. In order to deal with the lower world creatures more effectively, the arrowheads of the crossbow were plated with a layer of shiny silver. Puff, puff, puff. One had to admit that the seemingly reckless Nalu had an astonishing talent in using all sorts of weapons, even if they were shooting weapons. He didn't even need to aim carefully. Based on his intuition, most of the arrows would hit the barbed devil scouts in the face. Some of them even pierced the eyes of the enemy. The steam boiler and the silver plating of the arrowheads caused the rough skin of the barbed devil scouts to be as white as paper. These devils that didn't have the right to wear cold steel armor fell to the ground one after another. Even if they were just despicable barbed devils, Basaro couldn't remain indifferent. His shark-like face was even more sinister. All troops attack. Having said that, the Pit Fiend commander raised his serrated blade and teleported to the front of the formation in an instant. He viciously slashed at the ogre Nalu. Voodoo, slime trap. The ogre shaman Palu waved his newly repaired troll skull staff as he saw the situation and immediately went to support his brother. Viscous liquid spurted out of the troll's skull's eye holes. The pit fiends were flanked on both sides, causing them to hesitate. Fireball. Basaro used his spell-like ability, attempting to use a fireball to blast away the slime in front of him. However, he was still a step too late. A puddle of slime still managed to get onto his serrated blade. The brown slime soaked Basaro's palm, and his straight slash became stiff. The slightest mistake could make a huge difference. He slashed diagonally in front of Nalu, but didn't injure him in the slightest. Asterisk bang. Asterisk at some point, the ogre had tossed the steam-repeating crossbow in his hands to the ground and replaced it with an ebony chain. He stabbed it right in front of Basaro's shark-like face. The Pit Fiend commander's nose caved in, blood and broken teeth splattering in all directions. His huge body fell backwards. Hurry up and support the commander. A strange infernal voice rang out beside Basaro. He glanced at it from the corner of his eye. It was a spiked devil expressing his loyalty. I'll recommend this fellow to the promotion ceremony later. The Pit Fiend commander thought to himself. Chapter 429. Just as Basaro was considering adding a drumstick to a certain discerning spiked demon in the future, something unexpected happened. Maximum spell, Soul Shackle. Maximum spell, Amber Seal. Turning himself into a spiked fiend, the Demolic Snade easily approached his target. He extended his spiked arm and pointed at the Pit Fiend commander with lightning speed. As a creature of the lower realm who had soul and body as one, Basaro was affected by the soul imprisonment spell. His body immediately became stiff, and his entire body revealed a gray color. The Amber Seal strengthened this effect, and a large amount of pale yellow liquid appeared around the greater devil's body. They quickly fused with each other, and soon formed a sealed hole that firmly trapped the Pit Fiend. Snade then transformed back into his original form. All the devils present, including the Pit Fiend trapped in the amber crystal, looked at this mechanical humanoid creature made of gears and springs with astonishment. Unlike a country bumpkin who judged a book by its cover, the Batsa devil could see through the souls of living beings. They could see the dense aura of death on the steampunk half-lich's body, as well as an extremely dense mana. This is a strange-looking half-lich. Many of the more knowledgeable devils came to the same conclusion. First, the three ogre brothers had pretended to rob him, and then Snade, who'd been hidden in the devil's army, had decisively used a spell to ambush the commander while Basaro was brandishing his blade. In the end, the three ogre brothers and the steampunk half-lich had successfully accomplished their goal, and captured a pit fiend. I'll take over this army when I return. Snade's mechanical prosthesis drew a circle, and a portal that was sizzling with sparks was suddenly formed. Then, he hurried to summon Neru, who still wanted to slaughter Fish-Face Baras's army. After all, the target he'd captured was no small matter. He couldn't be sure how long his amber seal would be able to imprison the pit fiend. If there were any mishaps midway, the most important part of Keys's plan would be delayed for a while. Fortunately, Blue and Palu were present. While Nalu might not have paid attention to the half-lich's instructions, he was always willing to listen to his brother's advice. What was even more fortunate was that Snade had underestimated the effects of his spell. The pit fiend that was trapped in the amber seal was unable to break free in the end. Like a frozen fish on a chopping board, Basaro was finally delivered to Keys without a hitch. This scene was very similar to when the young blue dragon had subdued the half-lich. It was a pity that the pit fiend's outcome was different. In Kartha's plan, the pit fiend was just a tool. What he coveted was the wishing spell that could be used once a year. Hammer, Keys called out, calling out the new name he'd given to the war. Hammer turned into a saw blade. Make it as sharp as possible. Upon receiving the order, Hammer immediately followed its master's instructions and turned into a long saw. The teeth of the saw glinted with a faint blue light. Dangerous captives needed to be kept in check. If he wanted to restrain the pit fiend, Keys had to be even more prepared. Without opening Basaro's seal, Keys took Hammer and began to chisel away at the amber crystal. He sawed off the pit fiend's long horn, then cut open its skull and performed a craniotomy on Basaro. As the patient undergoing the operation, the archdevil didn't have any anesthesia. His skull was opened by Keys while he was conscious. He carefully inserted a music box, a clockwork megalosaurus that was in a state of mechanical fusion, into Basaro's brain. After repeatedly confirming the pit fiend's condition, Keys used the adhesive prepared by Palu and a healing spell to complete the operation. Keys then chanted an amber seal to dispel the curse. The hard amber crystal melted in an instant, flowing to the ground. "What did you put in my head?" Basaro immediately asked as soon as he was freed. Since he'd just regained consciousness, the pit fiend knew very well what the young blue dragon had implanted in his brain. He didn't dare to attack Keys for the time being, nor did he dare to casually use a greater teleportation spell. "It's nothing," Keys smiled. "I just need your help, and it's not even worth mentioning." He then used his psionic powers to project the power of the clockwork megalosaurus self-destruction into Basaro's mind, letting the pit fiend know that he could blow apart his skull at any time. As the most powerful Batsa-devil, the pit fiend's physique and regenerative abilities were strong enough to suffocate mortals. However, no matter how strong they would still die tragically if their brains were blown apart. Moreover, due to his physique and recovery ability, the process of death would be infinitely prolonged. Even though the Abyss wasn't like Bator, where devils had a certain chance of survival after death, having their brains damaged, and then being reborn in Bator meant that a drop in power was inevitable. Basaro didn't want to die, nor did he want to drop in power. When he heard Keys' words, he hurriedly asked in an attempt to negotiate, "Who are you, and what do you want me to do? If you can capture a pit fiend alive, what else can stop you?" The pit fiend unknowingly used the devil's speech technique again, even though his life was now in Keys' hands. His questions were specious, containing many facts that he'd already guessed. He just wanted to get confirmation from the young blue dragon. However, Keys had read Kanini's notes and had a deep understanding of how devils thought. Basaro's little trick couldn't fool the young blue dragon. "You really are a devil." Keys seemed to shrug his shoulders helplessly, but he still spoke bluntly to Basaro. "I just have a small wish, and I need you to help me fulfill it." The pit fiend furrowed his brows, because he thought of the hidden meaning in Keys' words. "You need me to use a wishing spell?" He clapped his hands with a smile, and the curtains next to the experiment table slowly opened. A huge device filled with brass pipes and hydraulic plugs, made by Keys himself, appeared in front of Basaro. Chapter 430. I need you to use the wishing spell. Looking straight into Basaro's eyes, the young blue dragon gave his command. He snapped his fingers, and the pit fiend could hear the sound of gears grinding in his brain. If you dare to object, misinterpret, or mislead me, the device in your brain has been activated, and you can go boom at any time. The threat was self-evident. In truth, the reason Keys wanted to kidnap a pit fiend was because these devils had the wishing spell. The wishing spell was one of the most powerful spells in the common schools of thought, and those who could grasp its essence were as few as the morning stars. If this spell was used in battle, and if used properly, it could even kill a Taraski. However, very few people would do so, because using the wishing technique in battle was, to use a word to describe it, simply a reckless waste of natural resources. Ordinary spellcasters who wanted to use this spell not only had to use up an astronomical amount of materials, they also had to deliberate for a long time, trying their best to come up with a wish that did not contain any loopholes. For a pit fiend, it was much easier for them to use the wishing spell. This was a spell they were born with. They could only use it once a year, and most of them would only reluctantly use the wishing spell that was full of loopholes when summoned by mortal spellcasters. However, there was no doubt that the pit fiends were experts in this field. Even in the entire multiverse, there was no creature that could surpass the pit fiends when it came to the success rate of the wishing spell. Keys and his magic consultant, the Demolixnade, could use the wishing spell, but they still could not compare to the pit fiends. I need you to make a wish for this engine to be able to operate normally for at least 100 years without damaging the strength of the materials. At the same time, the increase cannot be less than 50% of its original efficiency. The young blue dragon stated his request in a concise manner, and then explained the technical parameters in detail to Bizarro. However, the pit fiend was still confused. He could only guess that Keys was preparing some sort of secret weapon. In fact, there was nothing wrong with saying that, because once this engine worked properly, with sufficient power, the Bator fortress under Kitha's control could become a Toad City. A few days ago, the young blue dragon had moved all of Boomtown's personnel and resources to the newly conquered fortress. After emptying the warehouses of the nine-headed demon dragon and the burnt sacrifice demon, Keys built a giant platform with crawlers. Then, the craftsmen and the army worked together to reinforce the stronghold. Finally, the stronghold was placed on the moving platform. The only thing that was lacking was a powerful enough engine. Similar to the Clockwork Dragon, the engine built by Kith would not be able to withstand the weight of the mobile platform and Bator Fortress if it was not improved. It was just for show. In the beginning, Keys flipped through Stim's exchange list, looking for a replacement engine. But even if there were some of Morden's creations, none of them could make Fort Bader move freely. He had no choice but to change his train of thought and start improving the existing engine. Fortunately, this was a world with magic. In a situation where all his attempts were ineffective, Keys decisively chose to use a wishing spell, directly improving the engine's efficiency from a conceptual level. "I wish," Baylor began to speak. Under the joint supervision of the young blue dragon and the Demolic, Barasa had no choice but to recite the specific contents of his wish. The two powerful spellcasters who were proficient in the language of Inferno checked every word of the great devil's words to prevent him from carrying any personal information. There were no dazzling rays of light, nor was there any deafening sound. When the pit fiend used its annual spell-like ability, only obscure magic waves lingered in the air for a long time. Unlike mortal spellcasters, the pit fiend's spell-like ability would definitely succeed if it was not countered. In just a few breaths' time, the engine began to change. The brass pipes began to distort and become thicker. Gaskets to increase airtightness appeared at the joints of the various hydraulic pistons, and an unknown lubricant seeped into the transmission rods and bearings. The wishing spell has been completed. Hurry up. As a spell-like user, Barasa immediately ascertained that benediction had taken effect. He immediately wanted to ask Quest to release himself, even if he had to pause the ticking countdown in his mind. Unfortunately, Keys had not made any promises before. The young blue dragon waved his hand, and the pit fiend left the command room that was occupied by the huge engine. heading to a more spacious area outside. Then, the clockwork megalosaurus that had been stuffed into Baylor's brain in the form of a small music box suddenly transformed. The small metal music box spun rapidly, pieces of metal changing their shape as they spun, rapidly expanding into the shape of the clockwork megalosaurus. The pit fiend's brain was instantly ground into a pile of mush. The great devil did not even have the chance to grunt before he lost his life. His eyes bulged, and yellow and white liquid flowed out of his face. Mr. Snader, Keyes immediately obtained the pit fiend's general flag the moment he died. He immediately ordered the Demolic. Bring some people to take over this guy's army. We'll set off tomorrow. Shortly after, the young blue dragon teleported back to the command room. He could not wait to start the engine so that his traction city could move. Fill the black oil. Keyes sat on the control panel, picking up a brass pipe to communicate with the gore arms in charge of guarding the black oil warehouse. The gore arms opened the lids of barrels of refined black oil, pouring it into the pipes that had been set up long ago. It flowed towards the engine's combustion chamber, acting as fuel to support the engine's operation. Looking at the various scales on the dashboard in front of him, Quest reached out his hand and grasped a handle with a metal sphere. Crackling electric arcs appeared in the combustion chamber. The black oil that had been compressed and turned into oil mist was ignited in an instant. The expanding gas pushed the pistons, using the transmission rods to convert the chemical energy into kinetic energy. Listening to the rumbling of the engine, Keyes carefully checked the various instruments, hoping that nothing out of the ordinary would happen. That was the only way he could proceed with his plans. He had to bring his city to outrun the poison. Chapter 431. They skinned the skin, pulled out the tendons, dismantled the bones with Snader as the chief surgeon, Paulu as the main assistant, and Keyes as his assistant. They worked together to disassemble the pit fiend's body that had not dissipated after Basuro's death. They then placed it in a pile of minced meat. It had been 2 days since traction had been activated. After 2 days and 2 nights of testing, the huge stronghold named New Boom Town was gradually approaching the shattered gorge. 2 deep trenches had been carved out of the ground by the huge caterpillar tracks. Liquid with the smell of sulfur seeped out of the soil, accumulating in the trenches and forming many acid swamps. To ensure that the caterpillar tracks weren't overly corroded by the acid, the blood-armored fiends would order the laborers in Boomtown to descend with grappling hooks and iron ladders to clean up the rust bit by bit. The spellcasters would then cast steel restoration spells. Apart from this problem, everything else about traction was normal. With its outstanding heart, the mobile city quickly traversed the various terrains of the acid fog gorge. It was precisely because of this that Keyes had the opportunity to experiment with new ideas. They also began to dissect the frozen Basuro. To be honest, it wasn't just Keyes who was new to this. Even the Demolic, who was extremely experienced in dissection, and the Ogre Lich, who had astonishing talent, found this task to be rather troublesome. Although the Necromancer's school of thought had some knowledge on the anatomy of creatures from the lower realms, as well as relevant experimental examples, the majority of the necromancers were mostly low-level creatures. However, most of the test subjects of the spellcasters were lower-ranked devils and demons. There was no guarantee that no one had ever used a high-level dissection material like a pit fiend before. At the very least, Snade couldn't find any records of it, even after searching through the ancient records. Without precedent, mistakes were unavoidable. When dissecting the shark-like fangs, Snader had cut off the venom glands. The demon chill that sprayed out from the venom sac had covered half the laboratory. As he didn't know that pit fiends had 2 hearts, he'd removed one for Paru's case, and the remaining one had turned into shattered crystals because he hadn't dealt with it in time. It was all thanks to Keyes, Paru, and Snade's bravery. Had it been any other ordinary person dissecting Baras's body, they might have been put down by this dangerous experiment. After much effort and learning many lessons, the powerful pit fiend was finally dissected by the 3 of them. The only complete pit fiend's heart was still beating after being soaked in Marlin's liquid. The light but abnormally sturdy bones were placed one by one on the experiment table. The pit fiend's skin that had been completely peeled off was now hung on a special drying rack. The rest of the flesh and organs had been sorted out by the Demolic and placed in different containers for safekeeping. After doing this, Keyes took out a flask from his spatial equipment, pulled out the cork, and took out one of the Leviathan's egg sacs soaked in the nutrient solution and placed it in his palm. This was an essential ingredient for creating a Leviathan derivative. As long as there was enough nutrient solution, the small Leviathan's egg sacs could quickly develop into a Leviathan derivative. He then reached into the beaker with Marlin's liquid and grabbed the pit fiend's heart with his bare hands. While it was still in its original state, he immediately stuffed the Leviathan's egg sacs into the arteries of the heart, pushing it into the greater devil's heart with his fingers. Looks like it's a success. The temperature of the pit fiend's heart was extremely high, but the Leviathan's egg sacs did not burn. Instead, when the heart was squeezed, it split into several petals like a flower. Thin but sturdy tendrils popped out from within, piercing into the pit fiend's heart like an old tree that had taken root countless times faster. They quickly spread and grew, beginning to devour and absorb the greater devil's heart. I'm hungry, just as the Leviathan's egg sacs completely enveloped the pit fiend's heart from the inside out. Following the natural spiritual link between the blue dragon and the pit fiend, the half-finished Leviathan derivative continuously sent out signals that it wanted more food. The pit fiend's blood, flesh, bones, and skin are all yours. Keyes, who had long since been prepared, immediately replied, allowing the half-finished derivative to devour the materials on the experiment table. If there's still not enough, let me know in advance. There's plenty of nutrient solution. Having received its master's instructions, the half-finished Leviathan derivative, which had already turned into a muscular meatball, let out a joyful mood. Thousands of tendrils popped out from its body once more, accurately wrapping around the food that Keyes had given it and dragging it back into its body. Chewing sounds that made one's teeth ache rang out from the bulging white meatball. However, perhaps because the quality of the food was higher and the nutrients within were more abundant, the Leviathan absorbed it very quickly and soon became silent. Since the Leviathan's body had the blue dragon's self-adaptability, after absorbing the greater devil's flesh and skin, the derivative actually grew thick and short fin-like limbs, as well as the thick scales of the pit fiend's skin. Coupled with its oval-shaped trunk, Keyes actually felt that the Leviathan derivative actually looked a little silly. As if stimulated by its contrasting cuteness, the young blue dragon, who was standing beside it and observing its rapid growth, suddenly had an idea. He took out the shark-shaped Baras's head, placing it on the Leviathan derivative's thick shoulder. As if adding the finishing touch, the Leviathan derivative that had been simmered with special materials actually opened its shark-like mouth, quickly inhaling air from within its body. Its body began to expand at a speed visible to the naked eye. Due to the fusion of the pit fiend's heart, the air was heated to a very high temperature as soon as it was inhaled, and the Leviathan derivative slowly left the ground. Success, the young blue dragon said with satisfaction as he looked at his newest creation. With Traction, we need a ghost-face fish. Although Traction and the ghost-face fish had appeared because Keyes missed certain memories of his past life, it wasn't entirely a joke. With Traction, all of Keyes' forces would have mobility, and they could hunt to their heart's content in the current plane of the Acid Fog Canyon, a huge hunting ground. With the ghost-face fish, his scouting radius would undoubtedly increase greatly, and it was equivalent to having an extra pair of eyes that could be used for navigation. Chapter 432. Arhanger used to be a glorious Yakong angel. He bowed to the darkness for a long time and served as the Eye of the Light. Back then, as a surveillance oracle, he was different from a Mastiff Yakong, who often served as a heavenly scout. Arhanger had to lurk in the 9 prisons of Bader all year round to spy on the demon's lair. However, that was all in the past. Now, he had changed his appearance and started to serve Bateau wholeheartedly. He had become a fallen angel. However, the habits formed over tens of thousands of years were not easy to change. Our hanger was still obsessed with those ancient techniques, and he often studied and improved on them. Garin root, scarlet nane root, human heart, troll fat, nightshade, hellcat feces, salt of nothingness. Our hanger carefully weighed the materials in his hand. The ebony wings trembled slightly with our hanger's movements. It highlighted how careful this fallen angel, who was only 5 feet tall and weighed about 120 pounds, was at this time. Yes, I also need some death crowflower juice. Suddenly, he thought of something. He once again put some new seasoning in the big cauldron in front of him. The turbid soup, which was like the color of expired cheese, instantly became clear. He gently crushed a dry leaf of cinerea and sprinkled the fine leaf dregs on the surface of the liquid. A thin layer of smoke rose from the clear soup in an instant. All the dry leaves evaporated due to spontaneous combustion. It's done. Although he had made it countless times, our hanger could not help but feel happy every time he succeeded. Because this was his pleasure, making poisons, especially deadly poisons that could threaten the lives of the underworld. It should be known that such a potion was rare. Any pharmacist with some knowledge would know how difficult it was to make it. Whether it was the Thanner Reet demon or the Batsa devil, ordinary poisons could be called drinks for them. But our hanger's poison was different. The potion he made was equally effective and even more deadly to the underworld creatures. This former monitoring oracle relied on his unique skill to repeatedly thwart the schemes of some powerful beings in the lower realm. At the same time, he also saved his own life many times. In the end, he was promoted from an ordinary subsky angel to a legendary creature by the gods. Now that he was trapped in the plane of the acid fog canyon, and at the mercy of the god of virtual game Stim, Archangel did not want to sit still and wait for his death, which was why he prepared more poisons than before. Removing the cauldron from the magic furnace, he poured all the brewed medicinal liquid into a large test tube that he had prepared in advance and covered it with a cork. After that, he placed it on the test tube rack that occupied the entire wall of the potion laboratory. Countless test tubes were displayed in the room, gleaming with a dazzling light. These were the preparations Archangel had made to deal with the upcoming tide of worms. Among all the commanders who chose to defend the camp, he was one of the most resolute and clear-cut ones, because he didn't believe Stim's warning. The reason why Archangel betrayed the heavens was that he recognized the hypocrisy of the god he had served. Although he heard Stim's warning, he still stubbornly believed that it was a word game played by the gods. The brightest of hearts often appear in the darkest of environments. The fallen angel stretched his wings and moved his neck that was sore from the long hours of brewing potions. He muttered to himself, and the most depraved actions are often hidden in the most noble slogans. Compared to the time when he used the darkness as his disguise, he now regarded the darkness as his ally. Hiding in the sturdy fortress of Bator, Argansko made him feel extremely calm. Stim's suggestion of escaping to the shattered canyon always brought back memories of his previous wandering. The legendary fallen angel firmly believed that it was another trick of the gods, but he still made a lot of preparations. Compared to the other purebred Batsu commanders who constantly strengthened the walls in an attempt to passively defend against the incoming tide of worms, Archangel chose a more active and suitable method. He had concocted a poison that could poison an entire plane. And the terrifying thing was that other than Archangel and some particularly powerful creatures, none of the creatures in the acid fog canyon, including the Batsa devil, could resist the attack of this poison. The fallen angel did not have a good impression of his subordinates. He did not believe in the loyalty of these demons. Coincidentally, the Batsu had similar feelings toward Archangel. Which native Batsu would believe in a fallen angel? The pipe in his mouth emitted a faint light. The spiraling smoke shrouded the captain of the barbed demons who was criticizing the commander in a low voice. Those guys were originally heavenly creatures. Balls, the leader of the fallen angels. Even now, he is still plotting against the great Lord Nessus, the king of 9 hells. This was a group of barbed demons who were chatting. They wanted to mention a name, but did not dare to say it completely. Barzub, referred to the Duke of Flying Insects who ruled the 7th floor of Bateau. He was originally a powerful and handsome king of angels, but he fell into hell because of his arrogance. Later, he was demoted for plotting to assassinate the king of 9 hells. After the failed operation called Paying the Bill, Barzab became a slug. Even though Archangel was not Barzab's subordinate, he was also from the king of angels, and the native Batsa devil under him had no respect for this leader. Although these demons were not only bound by the hierarchy of Bateau, but also by the general flag signed by Stim, they still secretly disobeyed Archangel's orders. The commander of this fortress and his subordinates appear to be united, but are actually divided. In the clouds above Archangel Sko Fortress, a small airship was quietly sailing. On the deck of the airship, Keyes was holding an instrument similar to a phonograph speaker in his hand and carefully listening to the information sent. At the feet of the Barb Demon Scouts, an ordinary stone was placed there, but there was a lot going on inside. Not only did it wrap a lead-acid battery, but there was also a twisted pair of brass sound receivers that were sending electromagnetic signals. Just as Keyes wanted to listen to other information before driving the ghost-faced fish back to Bateau, an alarm bell suddenly rang in his earpiece. Someone attacked Archangel Sko. Chapter 433. It was not human beings who attacked the fortress of Archangel Sko, but thousands of worms and demons that covered the mountains and the plains. They seemed to have appeared out of thin air. No one saw how these guys gathered, and their vanguard reached the border of the fortress. Vrak, Hezru, Fisher, Glabrizu, Six-Armed Naga, Cambion. These parasitic worms and demons whizzed across the rough ground, letting out soul-stirring howls. Every fiend worm was a moving worm nest. Countless acid mist worms lived in it, entering and exiting it. Because of the pain of parasitism, these demons' faces were always pale and distorted, and their color was very similar to expired absinthe. Even if the demons had a powerful recovery ability, they would die tragically and humiliatingly if they were parasitized for a long time. At that time, the acid mist worms living in their bodies would begin to fight to the death. Finally, the acid mist worms that devoured all of their kind would rise from the corpses of the dead demons and evolve into true worm demons that were very similar to their previous hosts. Although the real worms could not have the profession level of their previous hosts, they could perfectly inherit the physical strength of their hosts, including the various magic abilities of the demon race they belonged to. Not only would they not be parasitized by the acid worms, but they could also control the actions of the acid worms to a certain extent. Therefore, as long as these real worms were in the acid fog canyon, their strength would gradually and steadily increase, and they would eventually become the ruling class. Of course, due to the different models of the hosts, all kinds of real demons would also be divided into different levels. The demons that crawled out of the Dretch could not be stronger than the demons that crawled out of the Glabrizu and the Hezru. As for the powerful Six-Armed Naga and Baylor, the worms that were born from the power of these top demons would eventually be promoted to the top demons, such as the Scourge Swarm or the Skywalker. They would directly serve the Tyrant Worm and lead the group of demons. At this time, in the insect tide that swept towards Archangel Sko, there were no powerful real worms. At most, there were some guys similar to Glabrizu commanding the army. However, under Stim's deliberate indulgence and the Tyrant Worm's manipulation, these guys were in high spirits. The sight of the fortress of Archangel Sko was like the sight of a hermit crab in a suitable conch. They wanted to invade, parasitize, devour, and turn Fort Bardo into a breeding ground for even more devil worms. Clang, 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 clang. The cymbals sounded the warning signal, and all the bats of devil immediately stopped what they were doing and rushed to the designated assembly square. The iron door of the dungeon was opened by the bone demon guards. The blind, deaf, and bloated demon slaves swarmed out of the dungeon with kitchen knives and wooden clubs in their hands, walking in an endless stream towards the designated direction. In the tower at the center of the city, Archangel, who habitually hid himself in the shadows, coldly watched the low-level demons as they prepared for battle. He had no intention of interfering. Once Bader's war machine was in operation, the commanders generally did not need to issue any orders except for an emergency retreat. They were all the gears and screws in this violent machine. Even if some of them were damaged or lost, the demons would have long prepared a replacement plan. Toot, toot, toot. The trumpeter holding the inferno horn blew the prelude to a tactical counterattack. With the accompaniment of the whip, the Inferno Legion began to respond to the devil worms that dared to attack the fortress. Due to the cultural difference between Arhankel and the other demon commanders, the walls of Arhangelsko were not as high as the traditional walls of Fort Bardo. If observed from the sky, this fortress looked more like a flower spread out on the ground. Layers of petal-like bastions protruded outwards, complementing the stamen-like towers in the center of the fortress. Facing the devil worms that swarmed towards them like a tide, the middle-level and low-level bats of devil captains all chose the same tactic. They opened the secret door in the ravine outside the bastion and urged the bloated demons to take the initiative to greet the enemy, trying to prevent the enemy from directly attacking the fortress. At the same time, the war machines were all pushed up to the top of the fortress and aimed at the devil worms that were attacking the most fiercely. They did not hesitate to give them a heavy blow to stop the surging attack. This was the Batsa Legion's favorite hammer and anvil tactic, and it was a complex one. They used the bloated demons as the anvil. If it did not work, they would rely on the bastion walls to stop the attack. The war machines were the hammer. If the demons broke through the phalanx of the bloated demons, the Batsa Legion would be the ones to die. With the order imprinted in their bones, every army in Bader's camp could skillfully master the hammer and anvil tactic and execute it perfectly. Of course, this was also a last resort. After all, in terms of the number of troops, Bador, which only had 9 planes, did not have as much resources as the Abyss. Looking at the whole multiverse, the total population of the Batsu people was probably less than a fraction of the demons. On the other hand, the demons' tactic had always been to win by numbers, swarming and defeating the enemy. The commanders in Bader's camp had long been used to this, so when they heard Stim's warning about the tide of worms, they did not find it strange. It was nothing more than more demons, and it was nothing more than the consumption of war resources. They believed that with their well-trained troops and high walls, they could always defeat the tide of worms. But would the truth be as they thought? In the outer defense circle of Arhangelskog, the concentric circular ravines, thousands of bloated demons and thousands of devil worms clashed. Relying on their thick fat as armor, these Batsu slaves and the vanguard of the devil worms were locked in a fierce battle. The real devil worms, mixed in with the devil worms, were waiting for an opportunity to lead a team to break through. They tried to attack the city wall, but they were met with heavy artillery fire. Even if they were unwilling to give up, they still could not move an inch. With his keen vision, Archangel, who was sitting on the top of the tower, could clearly overlook the entire battlefield. Seeing this, he could not help but feel a little suspicious. Is this the tide of worms? Why is it not as threatening as an ordinary demon siege? It seemed that the truth was just as many of the Batsu commanders had expected. The so-called tide of worms was just an ordinary demon siege, and it was not even threatening enough. Chapter 434. There must be something fishy going on. Sitting on the seat on the flight deck, Keyes steered the ghost-faced fish to the north quietly, hiding in the brown sulfur clouds of the acid fog canyon while thinking to himself. After installing Balassa's head, the ghost-faced fish had sharp eyes that could see through invisibility and camouflage. But after a long investigation, there were no sky walkers nearby. Keyes, who had seen the three-dimensional combat mode of the demon worms, naturally did not think that the attack on Arhangelsko Fortress was the so-called tide of worms, because the intensity of the battle on the ground was too low to warrant Stim's warning. Since he did not want to be discovered, he could not use magic for detection. He could only try his best to receive the radio signals from the ground and try to distinguish the whispers of the demons. The worms have been defeated. Idiot! Those are worms, not worms. Worms in the infernal language refer to the scythe-worm beasts that live in the Bartholomew wilderness. Shut up, you stupid new recruits. No noise on the battlefield. We're the military police. I want to report them. Gathered in the square, many Batsu devil began to whisper because they were bored of waiting. This also showed their deep disdain for the weakness of the tide of worms at the moment. But just as the Batsu devil guessed that the farce of the tide of worms would end soon, the situation on the battlefield suddenly changed dramatically. Almost in an instant, the bloat devils, who were the anvil, were slaughtered. A real demon worm with 6 scimitars suddenly jumped out. Like a real 6-armed snake demon, this guy waved his scimitars and danced a dance of death. Like a hot knife cutting through butter, the powerful demon worm used his scimitars to cut through the thick fat on the bloat devils' necks. These miserable Batsu slaves were beheaded. As they fell, a large gap appeared in their defensive position. Limited wish. Many true devil worms that were born in the body of the Glabrizu took action at the same time, performing the spell-like abilities that the original host was most proud of. Those war machines had exposed their positions because they opened fire. At this moment, they were all targeted by the limited wishing spell, and problems occurred one after another. The barrels of the Hellscream cannons exploded, the screws on the catapults cracked, the bowstrings of the ballistae snapped. The defensive weapons on the fortress walls misfired one after another. In the meantime, the tide of worms had new reinforcements. The Tana-Arit demons, even the weak Dretches, all had the talent ability to summon Tana-Arit. The same was true for the real demon worm that inherited the body of the original host. In the past, this ability was usually used to satisfy their feeding needs. But now, it had become the trump card of the demonic worm army. In addition, they had the support of the demon lord and the dwarf god behind them. Basically, all of their summons would be answered. As a result, the number of demons on the battlefield had doubled in just a few breaths. The defense system of Archangel Sko seemed like it was going to be difficult for them to continue. Panic began to spread among the soldiers of Batsu. The chaos that was even more unbearable for the demons appeared among them. Don't act rashly. Form a dense formation. Rely on the defense facilities of the bastion, and block those damned Tana-Arit. Many demon captains issued similar orders. They tried to establish order to reverse the unfavorable situation at this time. Others who were more quick-witted quickly reported to their superiors, hoping to get strong reinforcements from the fortress commander, Archangel. Their willpower is shockingly low. In the shadow of the top of the tower, Archangel used his ebony wings to cover his body. He witnessed the whole process of the tide of worms and was disappointed with the performance of his troops. They lacked discipline and the courage to die generously. When this fallen angel found that the first wave of Batsu's troops had been defeated, he finally could not bear it and brazenly took action to reorganize the discipline of the army. Gently jumping down from the tower, Archangel used the ability of Shadow Leap to catch up with the team that had retreated from the battlefield. He used his sharp steel swords to punish the captain of the team. Those who retreat will die. Archangel raised the head of Batsu that he had beheaded and issued a stern and straightforward threat to all the soldiers under his command. When he stabilized the formation a little, he immediately teleported to the tower where his war room was located. He took out a long key from his ebony wings and inserted it into the keyhole of the seat. With a soft click, the key and a mechanism clicked together, and several magic runes that indicated that they had passed the verification lit up on the back of the seat. In the potion lab hidden deep under the tower, the test tube rack that stored the poison suddenly emitted a burst of electric current. All the test tubes that were hit by the electric current immediately shattered. The poison instantly flowed out, and the heating magic circle on the floor of the potion lab immediately took effect. Bright red magic patterns covered the ceramic floor, and the high temperature that was enough to set anything on fire instantly filled the entire lab. On the ceiling and the surrounding walls, multiple hidden vents began to work at the same time. The poison evaporated due to the high temperature, and the fatal gas was sucked out through the ventilation ducts. Several towers located in the center of Archangel Sko suddenly rose a lot higher. Their tops slowly opened like flowers, and colorful smoke rose from them. Change the weather. Standing in the center of the tower, Arhanger used his innate ability as a high-grade subburial angel. Violent winds swept out from the center of Fort Bador, carrying poisonous smoke in all directions. Without the help of the blower and the wind, the poisonous smoke, which was heavier than air, began to slowly fall as soon as it reached the walls of the fortress. Colorful clouds fell from the sky and shrouded the demons that had rushed to the top of the walls. The moment they came into contact with the poison, even though the demons were naturally resistant to poison, the poison that the legendary level fallen angel had meticulously concocted was not something to be trifled with. Asterisk plop. Asterisk, asterisk plop. Asterisk, the demons fell to the ground one after another, painfully pulling at their throats. In the end, they could only whimper and die miserably. Only a few worm demons saw that the situation was not going well and immediately used advanced teleportation spells to leave the range of the poisonous smoke. They were lucky enough to escape and save their lives. I still have my old skills. Chapter 435. Just as Arhanger was laughing heartily, the attacking worm army gave the proud fallen angel a good lesson. The rough ground suddenly cracked, and several burning sky walkers leaped up from the underground tunnel and soared into the sky. These powerful worms that were born from Baylor demons opened their huge mouths and sucked the poisonous mist into their stomachs. After doing this, the burning sky walker looked like a drunkard as he staggered towards Fort Bardo and sprayed out the poison that had condensed into liquid in his body. Any Bat-Devil that came into contact with the poison would immediately follow in the footsteps of the Tana Re-Devils and collapse to the ground. Even if they were immune to ordinary poisons, they still had no resistance to this poison that had a different mechanism. Arhanger's eyes almost popped out of their sockets when he saw this scene. Although the fallen angel did not care about the life and death of his Bat-Devils, he still needed them. Arhanger Sko also needed these devils for defense. Evasion, Shadow Realm, Traversal. Like a drop of water falling into the ocean, Arhanger, the former Oracle of Surveillance, instantly vanished into the shadows. Using this method, he arrived behind one of the Skywalkers much faster than flying with his wings and suddenly launched a ferocious attack. Dual sword style, Iato Yingdinglu. The fallen angel drew his swords with a swipe of his hands. The two fine steel long swords that were enchanted with the sharpness spell were parallel to each other. Using gravity and the great strength given by his arms, he launched a fierce slash at the burning sky walker below him. Although his movements were fast, they were silent. While slashing, his tensed wrists were constantly vibrating. The blades of the swords were constantly changing back and forth, adding an additional tearing effect to the slash. Chila. The burning sky walker's back exploded in an instant. Two rough sword marks spread out from its back, tearing open its flesh and scraping off its fascia. Before the flesh and blood of the worm devil could heal, Arhanger stomped his feet, and the boots of speed on his feet extended blue boots. Fourth sword style, Great Whirlwind. The fallen angel's body began to spin rapidly, stabbing into the burning sky walker's back like a drill. Fourth sword style, Crow's Slaughter. When his body completely disappeared into the giant worm beast, the blades of his boots and the dual swords changed to another move, and his body swayed greatly. His feet kicked repeatedly, the blades of his boots scraping the flesh. His two swords danced in an airtight manner, cutting the fascia into less than an inch of residue. It was as if a juicer had been installed in its body. A fountain of blood and minced meat was spurting out of the hole on the burning sky walker's back. In the face of this violent, destructive power, even the burning sky walkers, who possessed powerful physical regenerative abilities, were unable to resist for long. After a short while, The giant beast fell straight from the sky. When it fell to the ground, only a thin layer of skin was left. Its bones and flesh had long disappeared. As a high-grade worm devil, the Burning Sky Walkers were not stupid. When they saw the tragic state of one of their kind, the other Burning Sky Walkers experienced a brief moment of grief before fleeing in all directions. However, this was of no use. As a legendary assassin, the former Surveillance Oracle had no intention of letting any of them go. Mirror image, wing illusion. Our hanger shook his shoulders. The ebony wings on his back suddenly fell off, transforming into two fallen angels identical to his original body. They chased after the two Burning Sky Walkers. Having lost his wings, he once again entered the shadow plane, emerging from the abdomen of the other Burning Sky Walker. He raised his sword once more and slaughtered madly. Faced with such a berserk fallen angel, the other worm devils naturally would not stand by and do nothing. Every Burning Sky Walker was the treasure of the Tyrant Worm. If all of them died here, the Tyrant Worm would severely punish all the worm devils who participated in the siege. In fact, they were already prepared for this. The true devil worms born from the Vrock devils all rose into the air. These vulture-like creatures flapped their wings with all their might, trying to intercept the fallen angel transformed from the ebony wings. Our hanger's original body was jointly attacked by many calamity worms. They used the Worm Gate spell to enter the Burning Sky Walker's body ahead of time. The fallen angel who was about to use the four-sword style to drain another Burning Sky Walker dry encountered these cunning creatures. The legendary assassin was not flustered by the sudden ambush. As someone who was used to big scenes, he had many plans before he made his move, including how to deal with the ambush of the worm devils. Poison blade, insecticide. He put his feet together and lightly knocked his heels against each other. The grooves on the blades of his boots were soaked with a green potion. The hilts of the two enchanted steel long swords pressed against each other and bit into each other. The crystal balls embedded in the hilts shattered at the same time. Four-sword style, big and small windmills. This was clearly not the first time Archangel had used this technique. His arms held the hilts of his swords together, and his wrists alternated between exerting force to turn the swords into propellers. Poison shot out from the grooves on the sword's ridges. His legs were slightly spread out, and the poison blades of his boots were like snakes waiting to pounce on their prey, seizing every opportunity to attack. Secret technique, scapegoat worm. Facing the rain of poison, the calamity worms did not have much space to dodge because they were inside the Burning Sky Walker's body. They had no choice but to use their secret technique to transfer the poison part to a specific acid mistworm. When the worm was completely soaked in poison, the calamity worms would expel it out of their body. As more and more poison was absorbed, the calamity worms expelled the worms faster and faster. Their bodies were rapidly shrinking at a speed visible to the naked eye. In the end, passively taking the attacks was not a solution. They began to counterattack, but Archanger's swords were so dense that the calamity worms could not get close enough to attack. Secret technique, worm bomb. Like arrows, the cataclysmic bugs continuously fired a unique type of acid mistworm at the fallen angel. With a whoosh, they approached Archanger. Moreover, these dark, arrow-like worms would explode violently as soon as they were cut by the swords. Even though Archanger had not suffered any substantial damage for the time being, his movements were unavoidably affected. A flaw gradually appeared in the originally fine wall of swords. Chapter 436. When fish rots, the head rots first, and when people rot, the head rots first. Adhering to this principle, the cataclysmic worm's bug bombs were mostly aimed at Archanger's head before being deflected, until the explosion affected the fallen angel's movements, and a bug bomb passed through a gap in his sword barrier. Oomph! Behind a mask made of ebony, the former monitoring oracle snorted disdainfully and tilted his neck to avoid the bug bomb. However, the black worm that streaked past his cheek suddenly disappeared, replaced by Helmuter in a purple silk robe, the incarnation of the tyrant worm. Due to the close distance, our hanger could not avoid being grabbed by the neck. Then he felt a huge force pulling at the flesh on his neck. And then, although it was only the incarnation of the tyrant worm, his true form was a demon lord and god with violent power. Using a sneak attack, Helmuter easily crushed the fallen angel's throat and tore off his head with a section of his spine. A weak legend, Helmuter pursed his lips and revealed a sinister smile. The fallen angel's head in his hand was still dripping with blood. Uproot this city. Eliminate all the bats of bastards. Don't let a single devil go. As a demon lord, he naturally would not make a second choice for an invader who dared to trespass into the plane under his rule. After giving the order to massacre the city, Helmuter seemed to be somewhat resentful. He felt that his punishment might be too merciful, so he wanted to change the eliminate the enemy to grind their bones and scatter their ashes. But before he could say anything, a light blue light covered his body, and an irritating voice suddenly sounded in his ears. Ding! This tide of worms has ended. The new fortress of Bot-Or has been locked. Please quickly assemble the worm army. The collective teleportation will be initiated in 1/3 of an hourglass. The countdown begins. Damn dwarf, when this game is over, I won't let you walk out of the acid fog canyon. I will. The previous encounter made the tyrant worm realize that Stim had been using it as a reward to raise the morale of all the flag holders. Even if Helmet didn't say a word now, he was already swearing in his heart that he would make him pay the price. Still, the tyrant worm had to make concessions to the god of virtual games since it still needed Stims help to clear out the Bateau Legion that was invading the acid fog canyon. Massacre the city in 1/4 of an hourglass and 1/3 of an hourglass. Gather at the open space outside the city. Spitting lightly, as if to demonstrate, Hemtar shook his body and broke free from the light blue light curtain that restricted his movements. Teleporting to the back of the burning sky walker, he aimed his finger at Archangel Sko and cast a powerful evocation spell. Extreme spell, Meteor Storm. Due to the meteorite that had fallen not long ago, a large hole had appeared in the thick sulfur clouds that had gathered in the sky above the acid fog canyon. The pale green sunlight shone on this land, which was a rare sight. On the ruins of Archangel Sko Fortress, a large crater appeared, and the impact glass was scattered all over it. Under the illumination of the sun, they reflected an intoxicating emerald light, like fireflies dancing in the summer night sky of the material plane. Perhaps this atmosphere didn't suit the aesthetics of the bottomless abyss, so it was soon crudely corrected. Woo 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 woo, crunch crunch crunch. The loud and clear sound of a steam whistle reverberated endlessly, shattering the tranquility of this place. Huge steel tracks moved forward, crushing the clumps of snake vines that had just settled down here. Poisonous smoke billowed out of the chimneys, filling up the hole in the sky. Keys, who was piloting the Ghostface fish and had witnessed the entire process of the tide of worms, was now busy guiding the fortress. After trekking for a few hourglasses, the moving fortress finally stopped near the ruins of Archangel Sko. It was next to the crater caused by the meteor storm. That worm attacked again. Keys landed on the mooring platform of Traction City. As soon as he stepped down from the flight deck, he saw the steampunk Demolik walking towards him. Go and check him out. See if he should be called him now. Evaluate the strength of his spells. After that, Keys looked at the ogre gourmet behind Snade, who was his logistics supervisor. Brew, take the Bone Demon Guards to search for survivors. If there are any, bring them back. We need to replenish our labor camp. After that, he continued to arrange a few tasks before walking to his command post, which was the core operation room of Traction City. With the assistance of spells, Traction City could be remotely controlled while moving. However, some delicate work still required Keys to control it personally. After receiving Brew's reply, Keys nodded. We found some bloated demon slaves in the dungeon under the ruins. The other Batsuit devil should have been slaughtered. He immediately ordered the laborers in the intestine of the city to get ready. A necessary tool for scavengers. With a smile on his face, Keys reached out his hand and pushed the lever on the operation table. He realized his intention with the help of the mechanical transmission device. 8 thick claws extended from the base of Traction City. The coupling structure of the steel track instantly fell off to reduce the weight of the platform. Like a giant spider, the Traction City moved steadily to the top of the ruins of Archangelsko with its 8 legs. At the bottom of the base platform, the gears were constantly rotating. The layers of armor opened up, and a big hole big enough for the Leviathan to pass through appeared. Creak, creak, creak. The joints of the 8 feet were gradually bent and deformed. The entire Traction City was like a hen that was hatching eggs. It slowly sat on the ruins of the fortress that had collapsed. The intestine of the city, which was located at the bottom of Traction City, was a cluster of buildings consisting of many yards and factories. It instantly became busy. The argon lamps that densely covered the yards were turned on one after another, emitting a light that was comparable to the eternal flame. The villains serving their sentences in the labor camps were like male cats, pushing wheelbarrows back and forth on the suspended walkway. The hinges clanked as the elevators went up and down, sending all kinds of materials to the various factories. The extremely strict demon foremen were never stingy with their whips to punish those who they thought were lazy. Although the laborers were inevitably trembling in fear, they were still full of energy when they were told that they would have extra food rations today. The 3 ogre brothers and the steampunk half-lich had already taken the elevator to the intestine of the city. They were also busy. Neru was in charge of maintaining order and security. Brew, the logistics manager, was in charge of registering the raw materials of the various factories. As for Paru and Snade, they were working harder. They had to check all the harvests and search for any high-value emissions. Traction City's stomach was rapidly squirming. Chapter 437. Since his companions were all working, Keyes was naturally not idle. He took the initiative to take on the most difficult work, leading a team of guards to inspect the waste removal workshop in Traction City. The Batsuit devil himself did not need to eat or drink, so he did not have any digestive organs. But in addition to them, there were also many citizens from other dimensions living in this new boomtown. These mortals not only needed to eat and drink, but they also needed to poop. Since there were quite a number of them, a lot of garbage was produced every day. In order to prevent the plague from spreading, Keyes, the mayor, issued a strict order that everyone must discharge the waste at a designated place. And these pickles would go through the pipeline into the manure tank next to the intestine of the city and finally be processed by the waste removal workshop. Although he was wearing a pig's nose gas mask, Keyes could still smell a faint pungent stench because of the keen sense of smell of the megalosaurus. Standing on the suspended bridge, he looked at the laborers in gray rubber suits, standing in the waist-deep brownish-yellow filth, struggling to walk while combing the viscous liquid with a long-handled rake enchanted with magic. Organic residues, excrement, and byproducts of the human nutrition process were mixed together. These things had to be separated from the sewage and waste discharged from the factory before they could be introduced into the cultivation factory. In that factory, there were many mushroom petri dishes, as well as special breeding tanks without brains for acid mistworms. They all needed to be injected with fresh fertilizer regularly. The big city eats the small city eats the town, and the town eats the simple settlements. Stim's game has a new theme. Thinking of a theory that he had read before, Keyes could not help but secretly sigh. This is really urban Darwinism. Just as he was thinking, the indicator light above the waste removal workshop's gate suddenly lit up. This meant that the intestine of the city next to it had been digested, because when the intestine of the city was working, the waste removal workshop's gate was set to be locked. Seeing this, the laborers waving the long-handled rakes immediately walked to the high platforms on both sides of the pool without any hesitation. The indicator light flashed 3 times quickly, and the drain at the bottom of the pool suddenly opened, and the final waste that had been sorted out all leaked out. It didn't take long for the sewage pool, which was the size of a small square, to be emptied, and new sewage began to be introduced from the manure storage tank. Toot, toot, toot. The whistle sounded at the appointed time. After inspecting the disposal of the filth in New Boomtown, Keyes turned around and left. Rising from the ruins of Archangelsko, which had nothing left, he pulled up the city and put on his caterpillar belt. Smoke poured out of the chimneys above the city, and the engine, strengthened by the pit fiend's wishing spell, started to move once more. Keyes came to the mooring platform and boarded the flight deck of Ghostface Fish. He piloted this speedy airship into the distance. New Boomtown had an excellent digestive system. The ruins of Archangelsko alone were not enough to fill its stomach. After eating until it was half full and accumulating some strength, Ghostface Fish led the way for the city, preparing to personally begin its first hunt. Since the other party was just a fixed Baturzu stronghold, the time of arrival had already been fixed under the premise that the speed of travel didn't change. Within this limited time, the citizens of New Boomtown followed the instructions and made orderly preparations for battle. Rumble! The sound of an earth dragon turning came from afar, and the earth began to tremble. In the command post of Sin City, an oil lamp had been knocked over, and several scrolls had been burned. "Damn bastard!" Naman Bingju roared in a shrill voice. In front of him, the little devil in charge of cleaning had his tail curled up, looking like a bat specimen that had been eaten alive. All of his subordinates were afraid of Naman Bingju. Even if he wasn't one of the strongest Batsu, he was still a vicious contract fiend. This information is worth more than your life, but you let them be burned. You really are worthless trash. He took out a scroll from the countless hanging on his body, and like a whip, he viciously lashed out at the little devil's head. Asterisk crack. Asterisk, a deep wound appeared on the little devil's cheek, blood-red smoke billowing out of the wound. Before he could rejoice that he'd managed to escape with his life, the little devil felt his mind go blank, and he disappeared without a trace. In his place was a creature that looked like a melted candle, a lesser devil at the bottom of the Batsu's chain of contempt. Naman Bingju waved his hand, and the lesser devil was teleported to some unknown corner of Sin City to do the most menial work. Ever since he'd arrived at Acid Fog Canyon, the contract fiend had been in a bad mood. This was already the 30th lesser devil he'd berated. Though he wasn't like the pit fiends, who could mold lesser devils as he pleased, Naman Bingju could still kill the devils he'd signed a contract with. This was the specialty of contract fiends, and, at the same time, it was a fatal shackle that shackled him. He was also bound by a contract, and the target of his contract was a snake-scorpion fiend that was perhaps even stronger than the average pit fiend. He'd originally had a great future ahead of him. After graduating from the famous academy in Nessus, Naman Bingju had smoothly entered the bureaucracy of Avernus. He'd relied on his familiarity with the Codex of Hell to take on the role of a litigator. With his glib tongue, he'd received many soul prisms every day until he'd met the snake-scorpion fiend. "I need a lawsuit service." The snake-scorpion fiend found Naman Bingju, stating his request bluntly. "You have to win this lawsuit. If you succeed, I'll reward you with 1,000 soul prisms. If you fail, you'll have to serve me for free for 30 years. This was a fair deal. From the information the snake-scorpion fiend had provided, the chances of failure were infinitely close to zero. After signing the contract, the snake-scorpion fiend and the contract fiend went to court. However, the crafty snake-scorpion fiend actually chose to settle the matter in court. Naturally, Naman Bingju had fallen into the snake-scorpion fiend's trap. He'd have to serve him for 30 years to repay the debt he didn't have. The crafty snake-scorpion fiend had no intention of letting him serve as a civil servant, instead sending him to Acid Fog Gorge. "You'll have to gather information for me. After all, most of the time, the prerequisite for victory is sufficient information. Just like how you tricked me into signing a contract, how much information have you gathered on me, crafty snake-scorpion fiend? Much more than you can imagine." The snake-scorpion fiend's fat and warty face revealed a cruel smile. The contract fiend, who'd been on the losing end, could only grit his teeth, but there was nothing he could do. Meanwhile, in Acid Fog Canyon, Naman Bingju just like all the other commanders of Bader's faction, had suffered the same fate. When will these days come to an end? Chapter 438. Naman Bingju ascended to the balcony of the tower. He was a muscular demon with rusty red skin. Thick curved horns grew from his body, as if he was protected by a crown. Apart from that, there were many contract scrolls wrapped around his body. They were both his weapons and his extravagant attire. As a self-proclaimed civilized Batsu, contract demons rarely participated in battles between demons. They either lived in the 9 prisons of Bader as litigators, or went to the material plane to corrupt mortals. Due to their long habit, Naman Bingju was only a civilian even after being tricked by the snake-scorpion demon to the front lines of the blood war. Compared to the fortresses built by other Batsu commanders, his encampment was more like a small walled city. There were no heavy gates or sturdy walls. Apart from demons, most of the people living here were fallen scholars from other planes. These mortals were under the control of the contract demon. They provided him with intelligence gathering and analysis so that he could better report to the snake-scorpion demon. To increase the efficiency of the fallen scholars, Naman Bingju purposely improved the environment of the encampment to make it more livable. However, this meant that the total amount of resources allocated to the logistics department remained the same. Since they focused on comfort, they naturally couldn't pay attention to the construction of defensive facilities. That shouldn't have been a problem. In the Batsu camp, contract demons weren't known for their fighting prowess. With powerful demon commanders in charge, the flames of war wouldn't reach them immediately, even if they were at the front lines of the blood war. However, the arrival of the god of virtual games, Stim, completely disrupted all of Naman Bingju's calculations and plans. Fortunately, during the initial chaos, the Batsu commanders were too busy attacking each other to pay attention to the gentle contract demon. That was why his walled city had been preserved until now. Naman Bingju patted the obsidian railing of the balcony and cast his gaze into the distance. He looked at the thick pillar of smoke rising into the air. It doesn't seem like the tide of worms. The contract demon pondered. The continuous tremors forced him to use eagle eye to spy, but all he saw was a blurry scene. Although he hadn't been on the battlefield many times, he knew a lot about the demon worms after collecting a large amount of information from the acid fog canyon. No matter how one looked at it, the huge blur looked more like a castle than an army of demons and worms. Could it be that someone is using Fata Morgana? But what's the cause of these continuous earthquakes? The contract demon cautiously guessed. At the same time, he did not let his guard down just because it was not the tide of worms. He issued a series of orders. Squads of barbed demon guards walked up to the top of the city walls and got into formation, ready to welcome the fierce attack that might be coming. The fallen scholars who stayed in the library all day long were driven out by the demons, and each of them was given a set of fine iron armor. As for weapons, for these mortals who were used to using quill pens, if they held a sword in their hands, they might cut their toes first. Fortunately, many of these people knew how to use spells. Even if their attainments were relatively shallow, they had the advantage of having a large number of people. The fallen scholar, who did not know anything, was assigned to the ballista launching platform to help the demon archers calculate the angle of attack. You can say that you're making the best use of people. The contract demon looked down at the battle preparations in the walled city and comforted himself a little helplessly. At the same time, he quickly thought of countermeasures. As long as it's not the demons of worms, if we can't withstand the attack, we can surrender to the commander of the Batsa Devil. The general flag issued by that god is impossible for others to give up, but I still have a disclaimer that I can use. Thinking of this, Naman Bingju touched the sharp horn behind his head and confirmed that there was a seemingly ordinary parchment hanging on it. This was originally a weapon that he had carefully prepared to turn the situation around in order to escape the control of the snake-scorpion demon. It was also a secret of the contract demons. As a reward for their service, they would have a chance to sacrifice to the 9 prisons of Bader once every 1,000 years. The contract demons who made the sacrifice would receive a special disclaimer. This disclaimer could be added to any contract signed by the contract demon as a remark. As long as the contract was not signed with the Liege of the Nine Prisons of Bader, the disclaimer would take effect immediately. Even if it was a contract signed between a god and a contract demon, as long as the god was not as powerful as the Liege of the Nine Prisons, the contract demon would instantly be exempted from fulfilling its obligations. After falling into the snake-scorpion demon's trap, Namen Bingju had not only used all the soul prisms he had accumulated, but also used his position as a frontline commander of the Blood War to embezzle some logistical resources into his own pocket. That was how he managed to gather enough offerings to complete the sacrifice. The disclaimer had not been easy to come by, and the contract demon would never use it unless it was absolutely necessary. But if he was forced to the brink of death, he would have no choice but to use this trump card to remove the restriction that the god of virtual games had placed on him, and then use interplanar teleportation to escape. Serving the snake-scorpion demon for 30 years is dangerous and unbearable. But it's not worth dying here. Of course, abandoning the city and running away was actually a safe alternative. However, the fallen scholars would not be able to escape quickly. If a powerful enemy caught up to them, which was very likely, the contract demon's army would be quickly defeated without the protection of the city. When that happens, the contract demon would have to decisively give up on the information he gained from the front lines of the Blood War and use the disclaimer to escape from the plain of Acid Fog Canyon. Abandoning the city and running away would be a useless choice. In fact, it might seem sweet, but it was a poisonous apple that contained a fatal threat. I can only hope that the city can hold on for a while longer and give me more time to pack up the information. At least I'll have something to report when I return. With that in mind, the commander of Sin City no longer paid any attention to the preparations in the city. He allowed the lower and middle-ranked demon captains to carry out their tasks. He teleported to the library where the fallen scholars worked and packed up all kinds of documents in a race against time. Meanwhile, the demons who had been on high alert were all trembling in fear. An unimaginable enemy was slowly appearing before them. As they approached the new boom town, not only did the ground tremble more violently, the hazy spell that had drawn in the city slowly faded away. "What kind of monster is that?" a chained demon asked Barb Demon beside him as the chains on its body clattered loudly. Barb Demon was equally stunned. "Beneath the Nine Hells, I see a fort bottor that can move on its own." As if cheering for their correct guess, the cannons that densely covered the walls of the new boom town burst into flames at the same time. The cannonballs with iron cores tore through the air, whistling and spinning as they flew straight towards the clay walls of Sin City. Chapter 439. As soon as he stepped through the door of the library, Namen Bingju felt that something was wrong. He flipped his hand and took out a scroll. "The cat is dead." The contract demon was in the library, but it was actually the room of the Intelligence Gathering and Analysis Center. There were many detection devices. In addition to the various speculators that were often used to detect spells, he also put in a cat box that was created by the ideas of a fallen scholar. He put the cat in a dark box, and through the spirit of elements, he connected the cat to a material particle that existed for a very short time. If he didn't enter the library through the normal way, the cat box wouldn't have flipped from the decorative altar to the next room. As long as an observer appeared, the material particle would collapse into a state of decay, and the cat would be completely dead. He didn't have time to mourn for his pet. In fact, this selfish contract demon didn't care about his pet's life at all. At this moment, he was more concerned about the observer. Someone who broke into his intelligence center without triggering any magic traps or being detected by the speculators must be very difficult to deal with. The scroll spread out from the sharp corners of his body and formed a curtain. In this way, the contract demon wouldn't be afraid of ordinary spells and swords. "Who is visiting here? Why don't you tell the master?" Namen Bingju didn't use the Inferno language, but the Abyss language. He was afraid that the other party was a powerful worm demon. "Since you are the master, Why are you in a hurry? Since you're in a hurry to leave, why do you want to be a good host? Ridiculous, ridiculous, why bother? The words reached the contract demon's ears. It was neither the Inferno language nor the Abyss language, but the official language of the Drow with a special accent. Knowing that he had been discovered, the half-lich Snade stopped hiding and showed himself in front of Naman Bingju. Just now, the contract demon thought that the other party was a Drow, but the thick armor under the robe made it difficult for him to tell. Of course, he didn't know who the other party was, but it didn't affect his decision at this time. Curse! The confident smile on his face became hideous in the blink of an eye. Naman Bingju took the initiative to launch a sneak attack with a spell. Due to the need to sign a contract with a mortal, the contract fiend had visited various material planes for a period of time. He boasted that he had a thorough understanding of the cunning creatures like the Drows, so he was not afraid to speculate with the greatest malice. He didn't have any intention of communicating with it, nor did he want to deceive it with words and contracts, just because the other party might be a Drow. And if he wanted to deceive a Drow who had grown up in conspiracies since childhood, the limited time he had now was simply not enough. The contract demon's malicious thoughts gradually turned into reality through magic, attempting to affect the steampunk Demolik. However, Snader didn't even have the slightest reaction. "TSK, you want to curse me to have my guts ripped out?" He even commented on the contract demon's spellcasting skills. Spells are good spells, but as a spellcaster, your observation skills are a bit lacking. The Demolik didn't have a body at all. His mechanical body was more like a unique mount. Naman Bingju thought that he might be a strange Drow wearing heavy armor, so he wanted to use Subjugation Curse to bypass the armor's protection and attack. Indeed, he wasn't observant enough. It was impolite not to reciprocate. The Drow Demolik, who advocated the belief that if you give me a punch, I'll give you a sword, also began his own counterattack. Extreme Spell, Hold Monster. Without any sound or light effects, only some targeted magic waves, the contract demon's body stiffened on the ground, motionless. "This little trick may be able to deceive others," Snader said jokingly. "But it's useless to me." "Well, I can't say that. Maybe it's useful." Batsu's dissection. He saw through the contract demon's trick. Although he had successfully avoided the spell, he still maintained his stiff body and attempted to launch another surprise attack. The Drow Demolik followed his wishes. A dozen fine gold wheel saws whizzed out of Snader's mechanical body and flew around Naman Bingju at lightning speed. The long horns that surrounded the contract demon like a crown were instantly trimmed clean. The other scrolls were fine, but the extremely precious disclaimer was still hanging behind the contract demon's head. Now, it had fallen off along with the short horns. With unimaginable agility, the sturdy demon quickly twisted his body, bent down, and reached out to grab his disclaimer. This set of movements could be said to be very smooth, and the reaction could be said to be very fast. However, the contract demon was still like a bamboo basket trying to draw water. He caught nothing. A powerful palm reached out from the void and slapped Naman Bingju's arm away, bending it into an unnatural angle. "Give me back my scroll." Seeing that the guy who attacked him held the disclaimer, the contract demon couldn't help but be furious. Following his furious roar, his rusty red skin instantly turned blood red, and a scroll appeared in his hand at an unknown time. Die. Because of the broken arm, he could only fight back with one hand. But because of the hatred in his heart, this attack was even more fierce. He used the scroll in his hand as a sharp blade and stabbed at the enemy who was half hidden in the void, thinking that he had to pierce through the enemy's body. But one wrong step led to another. When the legendary Demolik had already made his move, he should have decisively used the disclaimer to escape. Now that Keys had also seized this precious disclaimer, the contract demon was actually a fish on the chopping board, waiting to be slaughtered. Tiger claw style, breaking tendons and dislocating bones. Unlike the ancient martial arts on Earth, whose names were mostly exaggerated metaphors, the martial arts of the Nine Swords were much more realistic. If it was called breaking tendons and dislocating bones, then it would definitely have the literal effect. As long as one was hit, the bones would definitely be broken. The young blue dragon's thumb, index finger, and middle finger rubbed against each other, forming a pecking posture. He avoided the sudden thrust of the scroll and fiercely pecked at a spot 3 inches above the contract demon's wrist. With just one peck, the bones in Namen Bingju's forearm were broken into 2, and the flesh above was also flipped open. Then, Keys's 3 fingers reached into the contract demon's wound, tightly grabbing the tendons in his hand and forcefully pulling outwards. Sunset flow, throat strike, windmill fall. Since he had already made his move, the young blue dragon decided to eliminate all evil. He once again used the 9 swords martial arts against a devil that could be considered a spellcaster. The palm that had just broken the tendons slapped toward the contract demon's lower abdomen, while the other hand formed a blade and directly sliced towards the contract demon's throat. The former was a feint, while the latter was a move that was made later. Namen Bingju's Adam's apple was hit by the blade and instantly caved in. But that wasn't the end of it. Quest immediately used the windmill fall technique. His palms, which were feinting, landed on the demon's abdomen. His 5 fingers dug into the demon's abdomen. His palms, which were aimed at the demon's throat, tightened around the demon's neck. Both of his arms exerted strength at the same time. Namen Bingju was like a spinning windmill. In an instant, Namen Bingju was smashed into the ground. His brain instantly burst open. Chapter 440. The dead body of the contract demon gradually turned into a pool of sticky bubbles. In a sense, he had been freed. If there were no accidents, after 99 years, Namen Bingju would be fully resurrected in one of the 9 prisons of Bader. At that time, he would be free of the Lamia demon's shackles. The small general flag was wrapped in bubbles. It slowly floated from the remains of the contract demon's corpse to the young blue dragon, as if it was at his disposal. Let me handle this devil's corpse. Seeing that Keys had put away the general flag, the steampunk Demolik asked in a timely manner, and he received an unsurprising approval. Therefore, the process of the contract demon's death was distorted. It was unknown whether he was lucky or unlucky, but in the end he did not die. Or rather, he did not receive his ideal release. As a legendary spellcaster who was proficient in the school of necromancy, Snade imprisoned the devil's soul and kept it in his bag. Take over the Baton garrison here. Then, get the city intestine ready to move again and digest this. Sin City. After skimming through the information he had just obtained from the general flag, Keys took out a brick-sized radio communicator and gave an order. The Batsu garrison, which originally wanted to bombard this walled city, instantly gave up. The Batsu garrison on top of Sin City also sheathed their swords, took the initiative to open the city gates, and let down their guard. These actions stunned the fallen scholars. As they were not part of the Baton forces, they were not affected by Stim's general flag. Therefore, they were at a loss. Why did those devils surrender? A certain fallen scholar, who was smoking a pipe while calculating the trajectory parameters, could not help but ask in surprise. However, what answered him was not words, but the hilt of the barbed magic cannon on his back. With a light tap, the talkative bumpkin was knocked down. The pipe was pressed onto the fallen scholar's body. When he woke up again, he had lost his well-groomed chest hair. Of course, that was a matter for the future. At this time, Sin City had no time to care about other things. Everyone was busy evacuating this place as soon as possible. New Boom Town, which was crying piteously for food, began to move again. It turned into an 8-legged spider and swallowed Sin City into its intestine. With the experience from last time, the efficiency of the farms and factories in the intestine of the city increased by a lot. It didn't take long for them to finish digesting Sin City. Keys also had some free time to watch Snade's experiment and see how he manipulated the body of the contract demon. As everyone knew, most of the creatures in the lower realm were existences where their souls and bodies were as one. Their souls and bodies could not be separated by external forces. Snader imprisoned the soul of the contract demon, which was dying, and the transformation of its body into foam into the city was forcibly stopped. Due to the young blue dragon's head being smashed, the first thing the Demolic did was to add another head for this guy. Sneyd took out a vice head of the 9-headed demon dragon that he had collected. This vice head did not have a brain, so it could not think and remember independently. It only had a part of the brain stem and gray matter, which could be used to control the 9-headed demon dragon's body. This is a very interesting experiment. The soul and body of the contract demon are one entity. However, there are very few records of what will happen when its body is replaced with the flesh and blood of other creatures. Seeing that the onlookers still did not understand, he continued to explain. The old hag lord before Bartho created a brand new kind of Bartho zoo devil called the Suture Devil. She sewed the limbs of different devils together and completed her own creation. Suture Devil is not any kind of demon whose limbs were still alive. Instead, it is an independent kind of Batsa devil. This means that the creature that was created has self-identity. What I am doing now is trying to use the flesh and blood of ordinary creatures to merge with the body of the demon that is entangled with its soul. I want to see what kind of creature the new creature is. Although Sneyd tried his best to explain, the 3 ogre brothers were still baffled and couldn't understand the significance behind it. However, Keys was different. When he heard the word self-identity, the young blue dragon fell into a reverie. He thought of his own transmigration. Even though he had a very deep memory of his previous life, Keys still had doubts. Was he still the same person? If the birth of the Suture Devil race was a manifestation of self-identity, then their souls would definitely be different from before. In Keys's memory, there was a series of famous paradoxes in ancient Greece called the Ship of Theseus. In order to commemorate Theseus, the prince who killed the Minotaurs, the Athenians kept the black sailboat that they used to travel to Crete. With the passage of time, the wooden planks of the sailboat inevitably rotted, so it had to be renovated every year. In the end, there was not a single piece of material on the ship of Theseus that had not been replaced. The entire ship was completely different from the original material. So, was this ship still the ship of Theseus? Some busybodies collected all the materials that had been replaced and used these materials to build an identical sailboat. So, between this newly built ship and the one with all the changed materials, which one was the real ship of Theseus? Keys had once thought about it, and he believed that the reason for this problem was that the ship of Theseus did not have self-identity. The so-called ship of Theseus was just a name given to it by others. This ship existed in the eyes of its observers. After pondering for a long time, Keys suddenly had an epiphany in his heart. The me of today is no longer the me of yesterday. Although he was just muttering to himself, it was as if a bell had suddenly rung in his heart. It was as if he had been enlightened. Whether it was a human or a megalosaurus, the Keys of today was different from yesterday, and there would also be some differences between tomorrow and tomorrow. So, why should he be obsessed with the question of who was who? Keys was not the rotten ship of Theseus. Its existence itself was the best proof that it had self-identity. He suddenly thought of the mortals worshipping the gods. Weren't those mortals the observers, and the gods were like the ship of Theseus? The domain of clergy that represented the various abstract concepts of the multiverse had yet to be born out of my knowledge, so the gods would change. Suddenly, Keys thought of a rumor. It was said that the god who had gone the furthest in the domain of death, the ancient god of death, Jaeger, had taken the initiative to strip his clergy and gave it to other newly promoted gods of death. This was completely different from the choices of other gods who were highly exclusive. Perhaps not all concepts have yet to be born in self-identity. Chapter 441. Just as Keys was lost in his thoughts, Sneyd used the suture technique and connected the 9-headed demon dragon's vice head to the contract demon. It's a perfect fit. The steampunk Demolic meticulously checked for a long time before cautiously and proudly commenting on his handiwork. Then, he took out many large culture tanks that were filled with the Batsa devil's flesh that he had collected over the past few days. Most of the time, It was difficult for demons to leave behind a complete corpse after death. Therefore, Sneyd had to accumulate them. In order to maintain the vitality of these materials, he also used the culture tank that he had used to cultivate the biomass mussels and soak them in it. People only realize that they have read too little when they encounter problems. I only realize that I don't have enough materials when I'm doing experiments. Due to the fact that Sneyd had done this job countless times, he was familiar with it and even had the mood to say a few witty words. He stretched out the arm of his mechanical artificial body and reached into the culture tank to pick and choose, looking for a broken limb that was similar to the contract demon's body size. Although in general, Naman Bingju's body had disappeared into foam and disappeared, and the soaked Batsu's body was sewn together. However, in terms of some details, it was not the original goods, after all, and the muscles on the new and old limbs were still somewhat uneven. To the perfectionist Demolik, this kind of work obviously did not satisfy him, so he made some modifications. Similar to the method used to create the undead bodyguards and the muscle demon, Sneyd first took out a mixer that was powered by magic. Then, he poured some of the Batsu's flesh into it. He made the sharp blade spin quickly and minced the flesh into paste. Although demons have strong recovery abilities, the steampunk Demolik explained seriously while injecting the paste into the contract demon's body to fill up the uneven parts. They can't create something out of nothing. Conservation is one of the basic laws of the multiverse. As if to prove his words, Sneyd released the soul confinement on the contract demon after repairing Naman Bingju's body. He allowed the contract demon to naturally repair his new body and resurrect himself in a way that demons were not used to. During this process, the only thing the Demolik did was to check on the nine-headed demon dragon's vice head from time to time. He didn't want it to grow a complete brain. That wouldn't be creating a brand new Batsu. It was very likely that the already dead Dalamar would be reborn. After a short while, under the nourishment of the soul, the body that was filled with the aura of death gradually regained its vitality. The rusty red skin belonging to the contract demon increased little by little, dyeing the stitched limbs and the flesh paste that was used as filler red. On the other hand, the nine-headed demon dragon's vice head, which originally resembled a green dragon's head, seemed to be drunk. Large patches of red appeared on its cheeks. Due to the lack of a brain, this body did not possess any advanced behavioral abilities, such as thinking and memory. It only had the instincts of a demon. With the characteristic of Batsu's soul and body as one, if this body did not have self-recognition, it should not have awakened on its own. Even if it had signs of life, it was still the original contract demon, the kind that didn't have a brain, literal meaning. Seems like it failed. Looking at the gradually transforming body of the contract demon, Sneyd muttered in a low voice, "Clack, clack, clack, clack." This experiment of self-recognition in a new species gradually became a simple and meaningless process of resurrecting the contract demon. Due to the lack of a reference, the Demolik was not clear on which step went wrong, resulting in the failure to replicate the stitched demon created by the Anababa overlord. For some reason, Keys, who had witnessed the entire process, seemed to have understood something. He took out the flask that contained the egg of the Leviathan spawn. Keys had once successfully created a Leviathan. At that time, the young blue dragon, and it was the same now, did not have the ability to create a soul for himself. However, during the crucial step of cultivating the Leviathan, he fused part of his own flesh and blood into it, hoping that his adaptive ability would work. In the end, he did succeed. Furthermore, he created the Yazzie Beast, the Ghostface Fish airship, and many other brand new creatures. Furthermore, they seemed to have given birth to their own souls and possessed extraordinary intelligence. At the same time, they also possessed a relatively high level of self-recognition. In the past, I always felt that the adaptive ability was only used on the physical body. Now that I think about it, I'm afraid it's not that simple. This adaptive ability is most likely used on the soul as well, facilitating the awakening of self-recognition and then creating a more inclusive soul. Thinking of this, Keys took out a Leviathan spawn egg from the glass flask and flicked it towards the experiment table. Complete this fellow. Using his spiritual ability, the young blue dragon instilled his will into the egg. Replace its original existence. As the experiment had already been confirmed to have failed, Sneyd, who was in charge of the experiment, did not stop Keys's whim. Instead, he observed the new changes brought about by the Leviathan spawn egg with great interest. When the round follicle neared the 9-headed demon dragon's vice head on the contract demon's shoulder, it turned into a pancake. Like applying a mask, the Leviathan spawn egg completely covered the other party's face and was rapidly absorbed. However, this was not really a mask, and it could not nourish the skin. In fact, the result was the opposite. After absorbing the Leviathan spawn egg, the vice head, which was similar to the green dragon's head, actually shriveled at a speed visible to the naked eye. It was like a deflating balloon. After shriveling to a certain extent, the head suddenly split open. Thick, sharp horns pierced through the obstruction and slowly grew out from the inside of the head. The head, which was similar to the original contract demons, replaced the 9-headed demon dragon's vice head and was carried upright on its shoulder. The traces of the original stitches had now disappeared without a trace. It is a success. The Demolic, who had been paying close attention, saw through the gaze of the soul that there was actually a brand new soul in the body. In order to distinguish between creatures of the lower world, one could not judge a person by their appearance, but by their soul. A new soul meant that although the appearance and body were exactly the same as the contract demons, this body was no longer Narman Bingju. This body had completed its self-awakening. Spell Extreme, Retarded Touch. Seeing that this body had grown a brain, in order to not cause trouble, Sneyd did not hesitate to cast a spell to suppress its intelligence. The new Leviathan spawn crooked its finger, and a bundle of scrolls appeared around its body. After opening it, it blocked the Demolica's spell. Wait a moment. Chapter 442. Sneyd didn't seem to mind that the spell didn't work. As a powerful legendary Demolic, he could reap the life of his opponent at any time. Not to mention, Keys and the 3 Ogre brothers were also present. Dealing with a test subject that had gone out of control was just a little troublesome. Give me a reason. The Demolic glanced at the young blue dragon. Seeing him nod his head, he continued. Growing a brain wasn't within the expectations of the experiment. I'm not the contract demon Minenbingju. At most, I can only be considered a new type of Batsa devil, although you have all of the contract demon's power, as well as its memories and mental abilities. Keys interrupted him. But if it isn't, then it isn't. Among everyone here, as my creator, you should know this the best. Keys admitted this point. He crossed his arms and nodded. The Leviathan spawn naturally couldn't hide any thoughts from him. During the experiment just now, in order to complete the contract demon's body and awaken its self-consciousness, the Leviathan spawn's egg had already invaded his limbs and bones. Even if the newly born soul was mixed with the souls of the contract demon and other demons, Keys couldn't completely control its behavior like he did with the other Leviathan spawn, but he also couldn't lie to the young blue dragon, let alone have any thoughts of becoming his enemy. This was because the key to its self-awakening was the adaptive factor in Keys's flesh. After a creature awakened, it would inevitably have a self-fulfilling instinct. Naturally, from the Batsu's advancement to the adaptive factor, S request. Although this brand new Batsa devil was still selfish, he was paradoxically putting Kitha's interests first. How should I address you? In the face of Keys's seemingly casual question, the new Batsu looked as if his parents had died. He seemed to have gone through a fierce struggle in his mind. Then, he cautiously took out a scroll written with gold leaf and respectfully handed it to the young blue dragon. That scroll recorded his real name. Similar to spellcasters, lower world creatures all had their own true names, but the importance of a true name to the latter was far greater than the former. Not only that, although they were both creatures of the lower realms, their true names were far more effective in restraining devils than demons. Perhaps an abyss demon whose true name had been grasped by others would suddenly become hot-headed and place their hopes on the chaotic nature of the abyss in an attempt to break free from being manipulated by others. But once the devil's true name was known, there was no way they could resist. Malbolge, who created the Suture Demon, was a former Thane. The reason why she was completely annihilated in the paying the bill operation was because the other Thanes had done much worse than her. They had even planned many assassination attempts against the Master of Nine Hells, but they were not killed by the Master of Nessus. This was because the old Thane had something that was a threat to the Astamores. According to legend, she had a handbook that recorded the true names of all the Batsa Devil. Because of the strict nature of the Batsa Devil, their true names, which prove their existence, were much more important than other lower world creatures. Keys opened the gold leaf scroll that was handed to him. He saw densely packed words written in the infernal language. If he had to decipher the meaning, the words recorded all the parameters of the devil in front of him, including the source of all the flesh and blood that made up his body. In addition, there were no self-referential words in the inferno language. Batsu thought that it was not objective, so they never used left or right in their language because that was for individuals. They only used coordinates to express their direction. They also did not use yesterday, today, and tomorrow, because today was yesterday's tomorrow and also tomorrow's yesterday. They only used specific dates to express time. This led to the incomparably complicated text on the gold leaf scroll. It seemed that they could not finish reading it no matter how hard they tried. Keys had no choice but to use a word to refer to himself. Then I'll call you Naman. Hearing this name, Naman could not help but bow his head to express his respect. He also did not object to Keys's action of putting the gold leaf scroll into his pocket. Except for the knowledgeable half-lich Snade, the others didn't realize the deeper meaning behind Naman's actions. After grasping Batsu's true name, Keys seemed to be able to pry into Naman's thoughts without using any magic. This was undoubtedly a step further than the previous time, when he could only roughly sense Naman's emotions through the Leviathan's egg. Keys was now very clear that after completing his self-awakening, Naman's mind was now filled with all kinds of plans for self-realization. Since you've inherited the contract magic ability, you have a glib tongue. You're most suitable to serve me as a spy or a liaison officer. After hearing Keys's appointment, although Naman's expression did not change, he was indeed very excited. He knew that he had a chance to show his skills. Currently, my new boomtown is heading to the Broken Canyon. In order to stockpile more war resources, we're going to annex the other Batoan forces. Looking at Naman's burning eyes, Keys smiled. I need you to go to the other Batsu camps. I'll try my best to trick them into opening the door. Deceiving and bluffing are my specialty. Naman volunteered. Keys nodded as if he approved of Naman's work attitude, but he did not agree with Naman's own proposal. That will take a lot of time. It's not cost-effective to implement it. The young blue dragon took out a music box and put it in Naman's hand. You only need to enter the enemy camp as a contract magic and participate in the formulation of some harsh laws that affect the morale. Finally, don't forget to place this music box at the weakest place of the guards. Then you can return on your own. Your wish is my mission. Naman, who was surrounded by thick horns like a crown, bowed again to show that he would not fail his mission. Then, after only half an hourglass of preparation, the newly born Batsu devil packed his luggage, a few fallen scholars. They sat on a huge palanquin carried by a dozen barbed demons and left the new boomtown. Naman modified the memories of everyone who traveled with him. Then, the Demolic Snade checked them several times and confirmed that they only remembered a false memory of Sin City being flattened by the demon worm. They would be the survivors of Sin City and seek refuge in the Batsu camp closest to the new boomtown. Chapter 443. With the continuous outbreak of the tide of worms, several Batsu fortresses were wiped out in less than a day. Many Batsu commanders were worried and fearful. As former colleagues of the Batsu Expeditionary Army, They had planted their own spies in each other's armies. Therefore, the news of the fortresses being lost spread out almost immediately. Soon, it spread throughout the commander's social circles. For a moment, everyone was in a state of panic. These great demons were afraid that the next tide of worms would be their own camps. In the dictionary of lawful creatures like the demons, there was no such thing as luck. All the Batsu commanders were busy. Some were busy forming alliances, trying to form more alliances. Some were wantonly building defensive measures and sending out a large number of burning sentries. Therefore, when the barb demons carrying the palanquin appeared a few dozen pale sand away from a fortress, they encountered a group of soldiers. "Who are you? Why have you trespassed into Sir Keaton's territory? If you take another step forward, you will be killed by me." The one who spoke was a patrol captain of chain demons. As his lips moved, the chains covering his face rattled. "I am Naman, Sir Keaton's friendly guest, the former legal consultant of Bloody Chain City, and the generous donor of high-quality chains." Naman lifted the curtains of the palanquin and revealed his rusty red, muscular body. He flew in the air and arrived in front of the chain demon captain. He was not empty-handed. Instead, he was holding a bunch of steel chains with sharp spikes in each of his hands. He even had a warm smile on his face. In the 9 prisons of Bader, bribery was the most effective method of communication. The chain demon captain who accepted the gift immediately became easy to talk to. Looking at Naman, who only had a gorgeous satin belt around his waist, but had many scrolls hanging on his body, the chain demon captain even felt a sense of familiarity. To be honest, such an outfit was indeed similar to the customs and aesthetic habits of the chain demons. It was not the first time Naman had come to Bloody Chain City. As the secretary of the Batsu army, the contract demon had visited this place several times due to work. Many of the big shots behind the Batsu army were not particularly assured about the chain demons. Therefore, they always sent people to keep an eye on them. The reason for this was related to a secret. It was said that the chain demons were one of the original inhabitants of Bardo. They had existed for many years before the demons had established themselves in the 9 Hells. When the Lord of the 9 Hells led his army and successfully occupied Bador, a portion of the chain devils chose to submit and become members of the devil. The other chain devils chose to migrate. They moved from the 9 prisons of Bader to the Shadow Realm, where they began to thrive. As for the chain fiends and Batsu's chain fiends, they had always maintained contact with each other. They treated distant relatives as voice transmissions. It meant that through the Batsu's chain demon, they could obtain the latest information about the 9 prisons of Bader and its homeland. Up until now, the native chain demons that had taken the initiative to migrate had yet to do anything that harmed Batsu's interests. However, all the senior demons still remembered the past and never let down their guard against Batsu's chain demons. If there was a suitable reason or a suitable opportunity, the lords of Bardo would not mind completely eliminating this hidden danger. However, Bardo's laws did not allow them to sentence Batsu's chain fiends before they committed a crime. Moreover, the migrating chain devils had not been judged as enemies of the devils. The Batsu's chain fiends were not considered collusion with the devils. Therefore, the senior demons could only control the Batsu's chain fiends more and could not exterminate them once and for all. It was because of this that the contract demons who had worked as clerks in the Bardo Expeditionary Army would frequently visit Bloody Chain City to inspect the work. In fact, because they had to submit inspection reports every time, Naman's understanding of Bloody Chain City was even greater than his own walled city. Of course, in order to benefit from both sides, he still concealed some of the actions of the chain devil commander Keaton. For example, Naman had never written in the report that the chain devil Keaton was actually on a unique path of advancement. He had actually given up on the path of advancement as a devil and was attempting to evolve into a primitive chain fiend, a nefarious fiend. In order to achieve this goal, Keaton had continuously removed his own flesh and blood for thousands of years. He had used extreme methods to destroy himself, to the point that he could no longer feel any pain or fear. Under the surface covered by chains, there were bandages made of blood, leather ropes, and thousands of razor-sharp metal shards embedded directly into the body. It was as if he relied on these terrifying objects to barely hold his body together. Of course, even so, his physical strength was still much higher than the strongest mortal. Keaton had claimed that destroying his body was just a special hobby of his, and this was not a rare hobby among the devils. However, such an excuse could not fool Numen Bingju. The contract demons had once studied in the terrifying academy of the Ninth Hell. In a course called Common Devil Physiological Hygiene Knowledge, the contract demons had some understanding of the chained fiend's retrograde tendencies. Namen knew that the chained fiend's self-harming behavior meant that their ideology was approaching the even more perverted nefarious fiends. The nefarious fiends believed that through this slow method of self-destruction, they could gradually erase the barrier between the body and the mind, allowing the pain of the body and the pleasure of the mind to eventually merge into one, creating a higher life form that was close to perfection. Destroying the body was only the first step, because no matter how careful they were, their limited physical body would eventually be exhausted. The second step would be to head to the material plane and search for powerful mortals that could catch their IDUs as parts for their evolution. Once they locked onto a target, the nefarious fiend would attempt to harvest the most perfect part of the mortal's body. Healthy organs, clean blood vessels, sharp eyes. Targets with organs that caught the nefarious fiends would usually be captured alive and carefully studied how the perfect part worked. Finally, the nefarious fiend would carefully remove the organ and transplant it into his own body. Usually, these organs would be planted in very strange places. For example, the nimble tongue of a wandering bard that had been harvested by a nefarious fiend might be planted in his palm or near his heart, or the beautiful eyes of a certain queen might be sewn into the center of his torso. The purpose of this was not out of bad taste, but purely to make it easier for the nefarious fiend to destroy it. The professor of the Common Knowledge of Devil Physiology and Hygiene course for contracted fiends, a renowned pit fiend who was renowned for his erudition, gave the following evaluation of a nefarious fiend's path of evolution. Even if the theory behind their actions is correct, their method of constantly destroying their own bodies to achieve the perfect fusion of the body and the mind is destined to be a waste of time and effort. No matter how perfect the mortal materials they search for are, they're not truly perfect. They keep implanting these defective parts into their bodies, and the final result will be a huge mistake. Perhaps they will become stronger because of this, though I have my doubts. After all, even the overlords of the nefarious fiends are only at the level of us pit fiends, but they definitely won't become perfect. Furthermore, perfection has always been a relative concept, not an absolute. As we all know, the more powerful a creature is, the more perfect it is. If they were to choose materials for Batsu, I'm afraid that's not an appropriate analogy. To put it another way, if they were to choose materials for the Megalosaurus, I'm afraid only a few dragon gods could satisfy their definition of perfection. However, the nefarious fiends do not have the ability to obtain materials from the dragon gods. Due to their lack of strength, they can only limit the list of materials to mortals. However, mortals are not perfect compared to other races, and there are errors in the system as well. The professor spoke nonstop for an entire week in that course. The knowledge involved included mathematics, philosophy, logic, and many other subjects. Even with the wisdom of the contracted fiend, he could only understand half of it, but he still remembered one sentence. That's just the wishful thinking of the chained demons. It's just a trick of the losers who fled from Bardo and gave this place to us, the Bartsu, to deceive themselves. It's just that they don't have a choice, so their persistence is beyond cure. Chapter 444. There was no cure for the terminally ill, chained demon commander Keaton. There was no need to save him. Therefore, Namen decided to add fuel to the fire so that Keaton could reach the end of this perverted and time-wasting path as soon as possible. Similar to his efficient communication with the Sentinel captain, Namen prepared a gift for Commander Keaton. He was sure that Commander Keaton would be very satisfied. When they entered Bloodchain City, they saw Batsu, chained demons with rusty red chains, all over the city. They were now on high alert. Sigh. The tide of worms, as if he was reminded of the past, Naaman sighed. Those damned worms are huddled together, while the exemplary Batsu expeditionary army is scattered. Hearing Naaman's words, the captain of the chained demons had some understanding of the current situation. Therefore, he sighed as well. After passing through the suspension bridge made of chains and leather, the group of people entered the fortress of Bloodchain City and came to meet Commander Keaton. When they passed through the last iron gate, the chained demons who had been waiting for a long time had already lined up neatly and carried out the traditional welcoming ceremony. Asterisk clatter. Asterisk iron chains surged out of every chained demon guards, adding a canopy made of steel for the guests who were walking. A loud and piercing announcement suddenly sounded. The sound was like a file grinding an iron pestle. It was enough to torture the eardrums of mortals. The dictator of Bloodchain City in the plain of Acid Fog Canyon, the captain of the 33rd Division of the Batsu Expeditionary Army, the pioneer knight of the Chained City in the plain of Minoros on the 3rd level of Batsu, Bienbo of the Black Swamp. Lord Keaton welcomes the visit of contract demon Naaman. The announcement officer read out a lengthy speech. If it were an ordinary mortal, they would have been confused by Keaton's various complicated titles. However, the few fallen scholars who followed Naaman were all knowledgeable people. They knew the rules of Batsu's nobility. Therefore, when they heard that a mere chained demon had given himself a high noble title, they could not help but sneer. "Are you mocking me? In my fortress?" Several chains made of fine steel suddenly fell from the dome of the castle, like spiders waiting for their prey. Keaton, who looked like a mummy wrapped in a steel shroud, instantly arrived in front of the chuckling fallen scholar. The animated chains tied the fallen scholars up like rice dumplings. The spikes on the chains pierced through their clothes and pierced into their skin. However, due to the presence of the contract demon, Keaton did not kill them for the time being, even though he tortured them cruelly. "Brother Keaton," Naaman greeted the chained demon commander cordially before continuing with a smile. "You can do whatever you want with them. After all, they're all gifts for you." Gift. These people are the top scholars of a certain material plane. Not only do they possess knowledge that is beyond the reach of ordinary mortals, they also possess the best calculation ability among mortals. Although their souls have been marked with the mark of the 9 hells, their brains are still valuable collectibles. Naaman finished his long speech slowly with a smile on his face. He stared at the chained demon Keaton with sparkling eyes. When the chained demon Keaton heard the word collectibles, there was a hint of fear in his eyes. However, when he thought that this was his territory, he laughed unscrupulously. "I'm a chained demon, not one of those brain-eating mind flayers." "Your gift is very sincere," Naaman interrupted Keaton and said, "These are perfect brains, at least among mortals." "He is indeed sincere," the chained demon commander thought to himself. "But he doesn't know why this contract demon dares to show his cards here. Does he really have nothing to fear? Or does he want to use this as leverage to make some unacceptable demands on me?" Sensing the killing intent of their commander, the chained demon's canopy, which was woven with animated chains, gradually began to transform into a net. Like a snake, many chains came out from every corner of the fortress and surrounded Naaman and the others in the middle. Although he had accepted a bribe, the sentinel captain who led him into the fortress immediately made a choice. He took the initiative to prove his innocence. Like a whip, the animated chain on the sentinel captain launched a fierce attack and attacked the back of Naaman's head. But in the end, it only pierced through the virtual image. Poof! The animated chain then slammed on the iron sheet-covered ground. Dark magic. Tempting gift. The 2 spells took effect in succession, but they were not cast by the hidden Naaman, but by the gift he had given before. The 2 steel chains had been implanted into the sentinel captain's body, and Naaman had previously engraved magic runes inside them. The darkness instantly shrouded the chained demon sentinel captain, making him panic. Thus, the second enchantment school's enchantment spell was cast. At this time, the chained demon had some tempting ideas. When he walked out of the range of the dark magic, his eyes were full of greed. He let out a harsh howl, turned his head, and flew toward the chain demon commander. In his eyes, Keaton's steel chains were so tempting. That's a gift that belongs to me. Seeing that his subordinates had been bewitched and attacked him, Keaton snorted in annoyance and swung his fist heavily. As he punched, the chains wrapped around his arms stacked together, forming an incomparably huge fist. Bang! Like a kite off the line, the chain demon sentinel captain who was hit by Keaton flew out at a speed faster than the pounce. Keaton was completely unharmed. The fine steel chains around his fist didn't even have the slightest scratch. However, the chains on the chain devil sentinel captain's body were completely broken, revealing its pale body that was already covered in bruises. Take this disgraceful guy away and lock him in the execution room for 2 days of punishment, Keaton ordered the other chain demon sentinels. When these guys heard the words execution room, they all trembled. At the same time, they were glad that this tragic experience did not fall on their heads. Contract demon, stop your tricks. You're also a commander. You should know what kind of situation we're facing now. To everyone's surprise, Keaton, who was furious just now, calmed down after ordering the punishment of his subordinates. But no one knew if this was a trick he played. After all, when facing an enemy, demons always like to loosen the reins only to grasp them better. However, something out of everyone's expectations happened again. Hearing Keaton's words, Na-Min really revealed himself. He stood beside the chained demon commander with his arms crossed and a smile on his face. The traditional welcome ceremony is over. You are right. Now is not the time for internal strife. Besides, I have never liked violence. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.